Sandhills Sojourn by Stephen J. Koenig. Copyright 2024 by Stephen J. Koenig. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. No part of this book may be reproduced without express written permission of the publisher. Published by Sodtown Books. To all who served in America's armed forces, thank you for your service. We will stand by the right. We will stand by the true. We will live. We will die for the red, white, and blue. Unknown. 1. Mermaid. Joe Bauer spent his 16th summer in 1980 at his great-uncle's cattle ranch. His parents felt a job in the Nebraska Sandhills would be a good experience for their only child. It turned out to be a great experience, except for the 3 occasions when he almost died. Vast rolling plains sit atop the Ogallala Aquifer in north-central Nebraska. The underground sea of water lies below the mixed grass prairie, painting the sand dunes. Joe's uncle, Reuben Bauer, would say, "These hills used to sit at the bottom of an ocean that came after glaciers slid out onto the Great Plains thousands of years ago." He'd tell people with his easy smile, "It's a great way of life if you can afford it." Added, "I'm really working for my banker." Joe's parents lived in Ewing, 130 miles east of the Cherry County Ranch. His mother, Susan, was a high school teacher, and his father, Jim, was an investigator for the Nebraska Cattle Brand Commission. Knowing his uncle and aunt needed the help, his father arranged for Joe's summer job. His son had helped the relatives put up hay for a few weeks the year before. But this year, he'd be there all summer. On a breezy late afternoon in May, Jim dropped Joe off at the ranch, finding that Reuben and Hallie were not home. Lucky, the Australian cattle dog sniffed the boy and recognized him from previous visits. White sheets dried on the clothesline as a sprinkler watered the garden. Reuben's pickup was gone, but Jim guessed they were close by. Joe found his room and settled in. They left canned jelly and pickles made by Joe's mother on the kitchen table. Before departing for a case in Hyannis, Jim Bauer handed his son a Polaroid camera and a coffee can with stones and said, "Be of good help to your aunt and uncle. And remember what Sophocles said, 'Without labor, nothing prospers.'" He added, "Behave yourself this summer, Joseph." A horse whinnied in the corral as Joe watched his father drive off, leaving him in the Sandhills without a vehicle for the rest of the summer. He wished for a car of his own. At least he had a driver's license. Joe rode the horse beans to Cove Lake. He left a note on the kitchen table next to the jelly and pickles, letting Hallie and Reuben know of his arrival. Lucky followed along. The saddle leather squeaked while he rode through the maternity pasture. He watched the young calves sleep and nurse their mothers. Reuben would help a group of neighbors with their yearly branding of the new calves, and they in turn would help him. That was life in the Sandhills. Reuben's cow herd had dwindled. An investor from Iowa now rented part of his ranch, which had a small home his uncle called the bunkhouse. The Iowan parked his bush plane and a new Ford pickup there. He also pastured cows and calves at a second ranch near Valentine. A rich boy midlife crisis led him to a cowboy phase. Emerging from their winter funk, the aroma of the prairie grasses and flowers filled the air. Big bluestem, little bluestem, lovegrass, hairy grama, blue grama, switchgrass, and Indian grass emerged next to prickly poppy, hairy puccoon, and prairie rose flowers. More flowers like the sunflower, yucca, prickly pear, and field snake cotton would come during the summer. Wild begonias were Hallie's favorite. The whole area smelled fresh, the typical smell after a quiet rain. The vast azure sky stole his breath as the horse plodded along. The sun's warmth softened the spring breeze, and Cove Lake came to life. Birds flitted about, chattering and chirping as a knot of toads and an army of bullfrogs creaked and croaked. He felt the 3 skipping stones he'd grabbed from the coffee can. The ranch had no good stones, so he brought some along. Joe stepped down and pulled off his sweatshirt, pocketing the stones and a harmonica in his jeans. He hung his sweatshirt on the saddle horn and shouldered the strap of the Polaroid camera. The dappled gray horse drank lake water and grazed on nearby nubs of new grass. Blackbirds chirped wildly among the water willow and lizard's tail hugging the lake shore and shallows. A blue heron stood on the lookout and let loose its wicked cry. Reuben said the heron's shriek sounded like a banshee, but Joe didn't know what a banshee was. Lucky nervously ran up and down the lake's shoreline, sniffing at a track in the sand. "What's going on, dog? What are you smelling?" Joe bent over and looked down at paw prints, which he guessed were left by a coyote. He felt the canine impressions with his fingers. They were far bigger than Lucky's prints on the wet sand. He must be a big one, Lucky. A really big one. Joe sat on the log of an old cottonwood near the lake and petted the dog. Reuben had tacked a star he made from a piece of corrugated tin to the log, Hallie's idea. Large cottonwood trees with bark resembling alligator skin creaked with each gust of wind. Joe wondered about the age of the tall trees now shedding. He caught their white fluff gliding like stringy snowflakes in the breeze. A sedge of sandhill cranes took flight from the lake and joined a flock flying overhead on their late spring migration to the nesting grounds in Canada. Their manic chirrups sounded as if something fierce was chasing after them. He took the 3 stones from his pocket and sidearmed them on top of the lake, trying to make them skip, but none did. A perfect stone in the can was saved for later. A red cardinal rested on a tall cattail. Joe's mother would say, "Cardinals appear when angels are near." Reuben would say, "The cardinal is a holy messenger, a foreshadowing that good would defeat evil." Strong words from a man who didn't attend church. He photographed the red bird with the Polaroid and set the photo on the log to dry. He ate the Braunschweiger sandwich and the chocolate chip cookies he'd taken from his aunt's kitchen, storing the food in an empty bread sack. Lucky leaped and caught Braunschweiger. The boy tossed in the air. The dog looked on for more. After helping at the ranch the year before, Hallie gave Joe an old harmonica. He started to suck and blow, making a sound that barely resembled music. As Joe blew on the instrument, a bird flew in and landed near the shoreline. At first glance, he thought the bird was a mourning dove, then noticed its white and gray wings and yellow bill. The bird had a scar on its back. Joe spoke to the bird. "I remember seeing you last year. Uncle said you're a seagull." Reuben relayed that Hallie had found the bird after it had been injured. She nursed it back to life. Since then, the scarred gull has returned to the lake every year. Joe tossed a piece of bread from his sandwich. The bird hopped over, grabbed the bread with its beak and swallowed. The gull then began mewing. Joe snapped a Polaroid, set the photo to dry next to the cardinal picture, and hung the camera on the saddle horn with the sweatshirt. Reuben had told Joe not to fish or swim in Cove Lake. You can swim and fish at Opossum Lake. It's full of bluegill and perch. But no fishing or swimming in Cove Lake. That didn't include the carp. Reuben trapped in the shallows as he tried to rid the lake of the nuisance fish. He thought of swimming, but his mother forbade him from swimming alone. Joe's mother often worried about her only child. But Joe loved to swim. He'd be careful. Almost drowning when he was 12 led him to become a strong swimmer. His mother didn't know about his near drowning, but what his mother didn't know wouldn't upset her. And how would she ever know? Maybe just a quick dip in the water. Joe removed his cowboy boots and clothes, hanging them over the log. The cold water shocked his feet, but Joe thought he'd be quick about it. After telling Lucky to stay, he dived in. The bird continued to screech and bounce. Joe side-stroked away from the shoreline, took a deep breath, filling his young lungs with oxygen, and then dove below the water. He propelled himself through the foggy haze of the Sandhills lake. The coldness faded with each downward stroke of his arms and kick of his legs. Minnows and bullheads and green sunfish darted away from him. Snapping turtles were a concern. Before running out of air, Joe prepared to turn his body and propel himself back off the lake floor. Then, he saw something. A gleaming white object with an extended L shape sat on the lake's sandy bottom. It looked to be the skeleton of a large fish. Joe took hold of it, guessing it was a bone. As he pushed himself back up, his foot became entangled in a jumble of barbed wire. He yanked his leg, but the wire dug in, and the pain caused him to gasp and expel the rest of his air. Feeling woozy, Joe struggled to undo the wire. Then he saw movement as he gulped water in search of air. He felt arms take hold of him and push him to shore as he heaved and gagged. As he lay there, coughing and spitting, Joe sucked in the Sandhills air. His heart beat like a drum in his chest. Streams of water ran off his body while he shook violently. Joe stood on wobbly legs and coughed up more water as he caught his breath. Lucky barked warily and looked out over the water with ears perked and hair on end. The bird repeated huo-huo chants as if it were upset with him. Joe's shaking hand still held the L-shaped bone from the bottom of the lake. The raucous blackbird's chattering went quiet as Joe's heavy breathing filled the silence. Joe looked around but saw no one. White fluff from the cottonwood trees drifted over the water. After returning to the home place, the dog lay in the shade of the barn. Joe unsaddled his horse and hid the bone taken from the lake in the barn's hayloft, recognizing it as a jawbone. Joe watched a barn swallow make a mud nest in the rafters and decided not to tell his aunt and uncle what happened. They'd be upset with him for swimming in the lake, and they might tell his mother. He remembered he left the Polaroid pictures of the birds on the log. The two hadn't returned home when Joe climbed the steps to his room. While drying his hair with a towel, his body shook. The red cuts on his leg and foot looked terrible. Finding peroxide in the bathroom, he poured it over the stinging wounds, covered them with Band-Aids, and flushed the Band-Aid wrappers down the toilet. He then lay down on his bed and fell asleep. Joe woke later to find his uncle at the kitchen table reviewing receipts as he updated the ranch's business ledger. Reuben said Hallie had gone to bed early. She left him a supper of meatloaf and mashed potatoes warming in the oven. There was also cherry pie on the table and ice cream in the Frigidaire. Reuben said they thought he was to come the following day and asked the ashen-faced boy if he felt okay. Joe didn't mention almost drowning in the lake, nor anything about being rescued. He told Reuben, "I saw a huge paw print at Cove Lake. I also saw that the seagull with the scar is back again this year." At night, Reuben would often read to Hallie. She'd loosen her rust-colored curls from its bun, close her eyes, and listen to her husband read novels or from a set of encyclopedias. On Sundays, he read her the Bible she had brought from her home in Maine, which had small fingerprint impressions on the cover. Hallie could not speak or read. She used her own unique sign language to communicate with her husband. The couple, who had no television, often listened to music on a close and play stereo. While Reuben slept in his chair, Joe searched the set of alphabetized encyclopedias. His dyslexia caused him to write and read his numbers and letters backward or upside down. Joe first searched under the W's before searching under the M's. The book depicted a mermaid as a woman with a fin growing from her waist, webbed hands, long hair, and breasts. Joe recalled gliding to shore, much like when he almost drowned when he was 12. At that time, an older priest saved his life. He was unsure who saved him this time. For whatever reason, he felt it to be a strong female entity like his mother. The encyclopedia spelled out how the fictional she-fish kept items in their den at the bottom of the sea. They valued a hairbrush the most. He thought of the bone with teeth, the jawbone of a cow, maybe. But Joe had never seen the jawbone of a rhinoceros before. Reuben snored and readjusted himself in his chair. Joe glanced at a wooden frame holding a quilt displaying hand-painted blocks of American flags, a work in progress. He also noticed a Bible and several books about birds in the bookcase. Joe read that a mermaid would respond to music. Maybe his harmonica caught her attention. That mermaid saved my life. He shook his head and thought, "What the hell are you thinking, idiot? There's no such thing as mermaids." 2. Wolfdog. Bred, branded, and brutally raised by a Montana trapper and mountain man, the wolfdog was a soulless voyeur. The Norwegian crossbred a collection of wolves, coyotes, and dogs. Most of the pups died due to strange abnormalities and deformities generated by the genetic cocktail. Then, a white whelp born out of an albino canine, part coyote and part mastiff, and sired by an alpha gray wolf, survived its infancy. The genetic mixture created a white-haired pup, looking for a fight when it came out of the mother's womb. It killed its 3 dark-colored male siblings, born from the same litter. The trapper took the animal's aggressiveness as a sign of good luck, but was disappointed it was a female. The animal would have acquired the traits of its aggressive ancestry, but the master wished to alter the wolfdog's cognitive and antisocial bearing to something superior. Scarring maltreatment of the white pup began immediately. His abuse brewed the animal's soul into a ruthless white-hot stew. After the wolf pup survived its first year, the trapper placed a permanent mark on the animal, branding it with 666 on its side, a spiteful jab at the apocalyptic quote from the Book of Revelation. He also bolted an iron collar around the dog's neck and welded an eye hook to attach a chain. By year 2, The white wolfdog had grown into a giant beast. The man swore at it in his Norwegian accent, calling the animal ulvehund, or if drunk, white she-bitch. During a drunken nighttime beating, unhooked from its chain, the wolfdog broke free from the man. The man stumbled, then passed out and lay beside a bottle of homebrew whiskey. The animal's fierce anger welled up inside her chest. Closing in on the master's neck was the last she remembered. Then everything went black. She never remembered anything more. The wolfdog left her lodge and spent her restless nights fighting demons in her dreams, and then, by day, she'd take out her inner pain on animals whom she stalked and killed. How could she be or do anything else? The wolfdog had no hormonal inclination to continue her bloodline. Fierce carnage diminished the mating season heat, brought on by the smells and howls of other wild canines. A male wolf would not survive a courtship with the white wolfdog. The wolfdog found few adversaries as she roamed further onto the plains. It followed herds of elk and deer to where the bovine animals pastured. Its strength grew. She continued to kill, but not just for food, savored squeezing the life out of the most innocent of creatures, and relished feeling the surprised prey's body yield and then succumb. At night, the wolfdog dreamed of savage contests encountered along the way. A battle with a bear over a dead deer carcass left the brown beast dripping blood from its jugular. A mountain lion who crept up on her while sleeping limped off after the wolfdog's jaws smashed the big cat's front leg. A wolverine, with bear-like paws and razor-sharp teeth, drowned after a fierce brawl in a river. All killed or forever maimed, in or near water. The wolfdog also spent countless hours monitoring mortals toiling in their fields and at their lodgings. They would make for an easy kill, but she settled on the beasts making up her environs. Maybe fearing those beatings from her master left her skittish, but she knew the day would come when she'd take one down. The wolfdog refused to admit to slaying the master who raised her. The final minutes were still a black dream. When the winter chill began, the wolfdog sought old dens in ravines and ridgelines, with adequate shelter from the elements, staying away from mortal activity. She could go days without eating, but that rarely happened, given her ability to find and kill anything. Water was the most significant concern on the open plains, but her senses had heightened to the point where she could smell a pond or puddle from far away. And where there was water, there were opportunities for more killing. The wolfdog spent one winter feasting on mule deer and buffalo calves. A mother buffalo protecting its young was as formidable an opponent as the bear. The skills gained from a successful buffalo calf killing made her stronger. She often nursed injuries after such encounters, but her recovery lasted only a few days. When the wolfdog entered the vast plains, farther from her original lodge, she found the new area devoid of trees save for river bottoms. The vastness overwhelmed her. She retrained herself. The bovines and deer filled her massive need for meat. The wolfdog worked across the prairie, settling in an area with ample pockets of water, game, and bovines. She dug out a den on a ridgeline where she could see the area from all angles. The vast openness allowed her excellent viewing for any approaching adversary. The wolfdog long learned to avoid the internal need to howl, a tip-off to any enemies who might stalk her. Sometimes she emitted a barely audible high-pitched yowl when her inner urges became too intense. She only made kills of the bovines away from her den site to avoid attracting attention from the mortals. One cloudless night, the wolfdog came upon a scene from atop a hill above a lake. A full moon shone over the land. A wave near the water's shore caught the beast's attention. The wolfdog had slew many fish swimming in the shallows. A flash of white dived out of sight. She crept close for a sure kill. The wolfdog restrained her need to yowl after seeing a mortal emerge from the black water. The moon's creamy light refracted off its pale body. The mortal covered itself, then stopped and turned. The wolfdog sensed the mortal's awareness, watched as it scanned the area, and gazed in her direction. As the wolfdog's paws melted into the sand, she ducked her eyes to hide their fiery glow. The mortal walked from the water toward a light at a nearby lodging. The wind blew in the wolfdog's direction, and she inhaled this being as it trailed away. It had sensed mortals before, but this one left a salty taste on its tongue. The wolfdog almost decided then to do what she longed to do, but the briny tang of this mortal troubled her. She'd wait. The wolfdog crawled into her den, thinking of the mortal. She licked old battle wounds laced across her body. They mixed with the chain whip lesions and the infernal 666 brand left by her master. The string of scars stitched her anger tighter, and the metal choker clamped around her neck held her rage bound. Then, the last recollection of her master's face flashed, before her memory went black. The weather changed and rain fell. Cloud-to-cloud lightning crisscrossed the night sky as she sank into dark dreams that would never let her rest. 3. Branding time. Lake visit. After settling in, Reuben gave Joe a summer project. He began tearing down the old wash house, the original house on the ranch. After building the current home, the old house was used for storage and to house seasonal help or the occasional visiting relative. But like most things, its time had come. Reuben gave him a crowbar, a hammer, and a flat pry bar with a rocker head. Joe began by peeling the wood shingles off the roof with a flattened spading fork customarily used to dig potatoes. Reuben said it would be easier to burn the building down, but he wanted to save some of the roof boards, rafters, and studs as spare lumber. Reuben also discussed working on the outhouse that served prior generations. Years ago, he moved and restored the outside toilet, but the paint had faded. He liked having a spare as modern-day plumbing sometimes failed. Keeping replacement parts and extra supplies on hand helped one survive ranching and living in the Sandhills. One needs to anticipate such things, he would say. He liked the Ben Franklin quote from the encyclopedia. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Hallie acted awkward around Joe on the first day. She never spoke because of her condition, but she seemed more distant than the previous year. On his fourth day, while brushing the horses, Frank and Beans, Joe heard Reuben's pickup return home. Reuben had gone to Valentine to buy supplies for the upcoming branding, vaccines, ear tags, salve, castrating knives, and a new syringe gun and needles. He also purchased insecticide dust bags for the summer flies, which would soon be hatching. Reuben handed Joe a new straw cowboy hat after putting the livestock supplies on the front porch. Can't have you riding your horse without the appropriate headgear. I remember you wore one of my old hats last summer. Seemed to fit okay. Joe smiled and put on the resistal, tugging it down as his father would. After molding the brim, he nodded. Thank you, Uncle Reuben. Joe looked at his aunt, who smiled and touched his shoulder with a gloved hand. The first time she'd shown him such physical kindness. Hallie and Reuben had no children. He wondered if her disabilities were part of the reason. Reuben was taller than most men, and his cowboy hat only made him more so. His scarred, leathery arms, hands, and knuckles marked his time on their cattle ranch. Remember, always set your hat on its crown, brim up, and never on a hard surface with the brim side down. The hat will lose its shape. Reuben rested his hat on the table as such. It's how a cowboy does it. Oh yeah, and don't ever set your hat on a bed. It invites bad luck and evil spirits into the house. Hallie looked at Reuben and touched her lips with a gloved hand. Yes, dear, I stopped at the Sandy Slough store for groceries. By the way, Jed said a volcano erupted in Washington State. Mount St. Helens. It killed a bunch of folks, I guess. They all looked at each other for a while. Come on, cowboy, help me with the groceries. Reuben bought extra food to feed the neighbors, helping with the spring branding. This also included cans of Coors beer and Dr. Pepper. When Hallie saw a packet of Red Man chewing tobacco, she shook her head and scrunched her face. The morning of the branding, neighbors arrived and unloaded their horse trailers. A couple of the cowboys who were good ropers wore chinks to protect their legs. They all wore sweat-stained cowboy hats, twisted, tweaked, and bent to fit their personality. Joe felt embarrassed as his hat was shiny and straight. Jed Foster, who owned the general store in town, arrived with a three-wheeler in the back of his pickup. He managed to steer the Honda despite having a prosthetic arm. After turning his Kansas City Royals cap backward on his African-American head, he said, Well, this is an upstanding posse we have assembled here to process these juvenile bovines. Turning, he stuck his hook hand out for Joe to shake. Hello, Joseph. Good to see you again. I understand you're here all summer. Joe nodded his head and grabbed a hold of the metal hook. Jed then turned toward one of the cowhands. Hey, Walt, you old coyote roper. I thought you were retiring. Jed had witnessed the older man rope a live coyote on at least one occasion. Walt pulled the cinch on his horse's saddle and turned to Jed. No, Jedediah, I'm not retired. I'm just plain old tired. Well, Maybe you'd have more energy if you stopped chasing your pretty wife around all night." The older man smiled as he held his horse's reins in his teeth and put on leather gloves. Jed introduced Joe to Wyatt, another high schooler. The men turned and rode off. The cowboys set out on their horses and encircled the cows and calves in the maternity pasture. Jed drove alongside Walt on his three-wheeler and commented, "At least Reuben's pears aren't scattered from hell to breakfast like your bunch was, Walter." Walt smiled and took off after a cow that bolted from the herd. For every cattle branding, there was always at least one pain in the ass. Lucky helped gather the herd, nipping at their heels and standing guard around the perimeter. Reuben had asked the cowboys to leave their cattle dogs home, reminding them that Lucky doesn't play nice with other dogs. For the same reason, they had no cats. The bawling cows and calves were corralled and separated. The propane-fired stoves made the branding irons red hot as the vaccines, ear tags, and other supplies sat atop metal barrels. The best ropers in the group then set about their business, heeling the calves and dragging them up close to the holders. Joe and Wyatt were one of the two groups holding the calves down. They flanked the roped calf, dropped it on its side, and removed the rope. One would grab a front leg and put their knee over the calf's neck. The other grabbed a back leg and stuck the heel of their boot up against the hock of the other leg. They held the calves down for their shots, ear tags, and branding. Reuben loaded the syringe guns and monitored the fire, keeping the irons hot. He also handled the castrating of the bull calves. A bucket of water stowed the calf testicles for the crew at the American Legion, a delicacy Hallie failed to appreciate. Wyatt chided Joe throughout the entire morning. "That there's a nice horse you're riding. It's too bad you ride like a city boy. Maybe you should get some riding lessons. If you want, I could teach you." Joe tried to take the remarks in stride. He tripped once, and Wyatt gave a big laugh. "Be careful, city boy. You don't want to get that fancy new hat dirty." The cowboys handled other veterinary duties while examining the herd. One cow was run through a squeeze chute to treat an anal prolapse. Another required treatment for foot rot. And they gave antibiotics for bovine mastitis to another. She and her calf were separated from the herd and put in the corral by the barn for more treatment. The calf might become a bottle baby. Hallie relished caring for such calves. Wyatt kept up the teasing. "Hey, city boy, maybe you should go help out in the kitchen. I'm getting hungry. Don't forget to have your aunt yell real loud when dinner's ready." Joe had had enough. After knocking Wyatt to the ground, he said, "Shut your mouth, you jackass. You don't talk about her." Wyatt stood and punched Joe's face, catching him in the eye and knocking the resistal off his head. Remembering a boxing lesson from his father, Joe hit Wyatt with two lefts to the face and finished with a right cross to the eye, knocking the boy to the ground. "Stand up, you shithead." The cowboys moved in and pulled the two apart. Wyatt's dad grabbed his son by the scruff of the neck as blood ran from the boy's lower lip. "I think you've had enough, son. After what you said, you had that coming. If he hadn't knocked you down, I would've. Let's get our work done." After picking up Joe's hat and handing it back to him, he yelled, "Sorry for this nonsense, Reuben." Reuben raised a hand and gave Joe a wry smile and a nod, having heard Wyatt's comment about his wife. Joe's hands were shaking, a sign of the boys' first fistfight. The men finished the branding, turned the cows and calves back out to the maternity pasture, and policed up the supplies. Hallie, hair in a tight fireball, rang a bell, and the men gathered around. After Jed said grace, the men filled their plates and sat about the place in the shade. Hallie had prepared roast beef, pork and beans, corn, and flatbread for dinner. Reuben announced she had also made rhubarb strawberry pie and homemade ice cream for dessert. Reuben and Joe tried to help her, but she shooed them away with her gloved hands. The cowboys were generous with their thank yous and hat tips. Hallie nodded, smiled, and carried a metal pan while picking up the paper plates and plastic silverware. They all drank iced tea and beer, and the boys had several cans of Dr. Pepper. The cowboys tossed pieces of bread and meat to Lucky, who made a show of catching the food in mid-air. Wyatt walked up to Joe. "I'm sorry about that. I apologize for being a jackass. We okay?" He stuck out a hand and Joe took hold of it. "My mom says I get all cocky because I'm going through the teenage changes. My dad says there ain't no excuse for bad behavior. I guess he's probably right. Sometimes I say shit before I think." The two boys stood silently, kicking their cowboy boots in the dust. "You play football there at Ewing? We're going from 8-man to 6-man this year. I hope to start at quarterback. Not that I have much competition for the job. I'm the only boy in the junior class. There's talk of closing the school and us merging with Valentine. Talk hell, it's gonna happen. I'm a lineman. We're still 11-man, but I hear we're the smallest 11-man school in the state. And our school is getting smaller too. Wyatt added, I was thrown out of a game last year for punching a guy. Probably shouldn't have done that. Joe mentioned getting a personal foul for swearing in the team soap scrimmage at the start of the year. Our coach is a good Catholic guy. So after the next practice, Coach McCabe goes, Bauer, bring your foul mouth and meet me at the pit. The pit is a rodeo arena next to our practice field. The coach had plowed it up, so you were running in deep dirt. I ran wind sprints until I puked. I didn't swear the rest of the season. Wyatt brought a football and asked Joe to have a catch. The two boys in their cowboy hats threw the ball as the men drank beer and gossiped like schoolgirls. Lucky found a spot to watch the boys from the shade of a tree. Jed Foster, a wad of red man chewing tobacco wedged between cheek and gums, joined the boys' game of catch before returning to his beer. The prosthetic hook hand was never an issue for him. They overheard the cowboys talking about a recent ghost wolf sighting. A white canine described as part wolf and part coyote had killed calves at various ranches. Walt noted that the coyotes appeared to have left the area save for a few brave loners. There was also talk about the reward for the wolfdog. The black eyes had turned to shades of black, blue, and green on Joe and Wyatt's faces. Wyatt asked Joe if he had a girlfriend. Joe shook his head. Nope, I don't even have a car. Hard to make out with a girl if you don't have a car. I just got a used black Thunderbird. Wyatt sat his cowboy hat down, crown side first on the tailgate of a pickup. Not many kids in my class here. I've known the girls my whole life. They're more like my sisters. Yeah, I get that. My dad met your dad once. He's the state cattle brand detective. That must be a cool job. Yep, I think so. He doesn't talk much about it, though. I'll probably go to UNL after high school. My dad wants me to major in animal science. I'd like to go to Lincoln, but I don't know if I'm... Wyatt interrupted himself, saying nothing of thoughts of being a chiropractor, an occupation he learned about after reading a magazine in his dentist's office. How about you? I've had a couple of ideas. Maybe the 2-year school in Norfolk. Not sure I can handle a 4-year college. Joe didn't relay his problem with dyslexia. I've thought about being a pilot. A crop duster I know has given me a couple of rides in a small plane. That would be cool. My dad said your dad got bunged up after a horse rolled over on him. Yep, tore him up pretty bad. Couldn't handle ranch work any longer. My dad's brother died when a bronc flipped over on him. He was 20 years old when the accident happened at the Burwell Rodeo. My dad won't let me have nothing to do with the rodeo. I wouldn't mind trying out bull riding. Those guys are studs. Wyatt picked up a stick and heaved it at a fence post. I did meet a girl at Nebraska land days in North Platte. She tried to call me once. My mom answered the phone. This girl asked me if I wanted to go out on a date. She also asked what kind of car I drove. I lied and told her I already had a girlfriend. My mom didn't know girls asked boys out on dates now. Joe said nothing about being friends with a girl named Caroline, a friend of his cousin's who lived a couple of hours away. Wyatt pulled his t-shirt out of his jeans. You been getting ready for football? I got a weight set in our machine shed if you ever want to do some lifting. I also try to run a mile or two every day. Joe had no plans to do any fitness work before the football season. He'd brought an old pair of gym shoes in case he had to do some painting. Maybe I can come in the evening and lift. We can spot each other. Before the cowboys left, Wyatt walked up to Hallie, tipped his hat, and thanked her for the wonderful meal, making sure his father and Reuben Bauer took it all in. Wyatt held out his hand to Joe. We okay, city boy? Joe smiled and shook his hand. We're okay, cowboy. In the evening, Joe told Hallie and Reuben he'd take Beans for a ride and maybe go fishing at Opossum Lake. He made sure the two saw him riding off with his fishing pole, knowing he had no intention of fishing. Joe told the dog Lucky to stay home. He rode out to Cove Lake, taking in the orange cumulonimbus clouds painted by the sinking sun. The breeze settled to a whisper. Meadowlarks followed and chirped about as the horse trod through the prairie grass. They arrived at the lake, and Joe let loose the reins and slid down. The horse barely moved from the spot. The rhythmic ratcheting of the bullfrogs and toads blended with mourning doves cooing in the cottonwoods and the chattering of blackbirds. The nightly concert included a performance by a lone coyote howling and yipping in the distance. The performers were all hidden in the hills or perched amongst the waterweeds. The cacophony of the Sandhills creatures could be overwhelming. Joe touched his tender, bruised eye and thought of the morning's branding. Beans stood sleep-like as the boy sat on the tree log, fumbling with his harmonica. Chicken hawks circled overhead, then rode a current of air and disappeared into the sun. He thought of the mermaid saving his life. The white bird flew in, squawking at Joe. "I don't got any food, Mr. Seagull." The bird continued with its meowing and other grunts. Joe thought the bird needed a name. The two looked at each other. He had forgotten the skipping stones. Joe blew on his harmonica, settling in on a tune of his own invention. The frogs briefly stopped croaking when he blew on the instrument. The gulls squawked and bounced along the shoreline. Then, a splash. Joe looked up, catching the ripple on the calm lake. His heart skipped as a small wave flared on the water. There may have been a fin from a fish, but it was a small fin. Joe removed his hat, setting the crown side down on the log. Blowing again, the gulls squawked along with the tune. Another wave caught his attention, but nothing indicated the presence of a mermaid with a big tail fin, long flowing hair, and naked breasts. A male cinnamon teal made a car courting call to its mate, who returned with a gak-gak-gak-gar. The male's color matched the uncle's red barn. In the distance, Joe heard a rumble. An orange and white plane flew low, circling the lake, then banking off to what Joe's dyslexic brain guessed was north. The sun dipped lower as Joe thought of the mermaid at the bottom of the lake and talked to himself. "You were about to pass out and were just seeing things." The scarred gull looked at Joe. There were no signs of new paw prints on the shore. Joe pulled down his hat to block the sinking sun and thought of the cowboy's talk of the ghost dog. After mounting Beans, he looked back to catch a final glimpse of the lake. The fading sun bounced light beams off the water. But again, there were no tail fins, long hair, or naked breasts. Joe rode back to the home place as day melted into the grass. 4. Jed Foster. Lake Whistles. Jedediah Jed Foster owned the Sandy Slough General Store in Flatwater, Nebraska. He and his older brother, Moses, were the only African Americans in the town. Jed wore a prosthetic since a power takeoff shaft on a hay baler mangled his arm. After the accident, his brother Moses freed him and drove him to the ranch house. His mother called the sheriff's office, and a helicopter picked Jed up at their ranch and delivered him to the hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. Only the toughest of men could survive such an ordeal. Jed was 13 when the incident happened. His brother was 15. Their father had passed away the month before. Moses remembered sand blowing over him when the helicopter took off from their ranch with his brother. The beat of the rotors vibrated in his chest. The prosthetic arm kept Jed out of the Vietnam War. Despite his handicap, he stayed busy. The store carried basic groceries, household products, beer, spirits and sodas, hardware, including tools as well as nails and screws, school supplies for kids, essential medicines, apples, candy, chips, baby diapers, infant milk formula, and ammunition for shotguns and rifles. Soft-serve ice cream was also available. Jed was the editor for the Flatwater Dispatch. The small paper came out every few months, depending on how busy he was. Groups and clubs used the large room at the back of the store. He provided coffee, soft drinks, and alcohol for such gatherings. Jed was a licensed barber, fishing and hunting guide, certified CPR instructor, paramedic, fire chief, mayor, librarian, village clerk, and the exalted ruler over 9 active members of the Elks Lodge. The American Legion held their monthly meetings at his store. Jed was also an unlicensed pilot. The Federal Aviation Administration tried but failed to find his airplane. They heard he only flew locally and avoided airports. Reuben and Joe made their way to Flatwater. Reuben asked Hallie if she wanted to go along, but she shook her head and wiped the stove in the kitchen. She made a hand gesture, and Reuben said he'd remember. Hallie made another gesture and pointed out the window to the bird feeder in the garden. Reuben said, "I'll remember the bird food, dear." A minute from the home place, Reuben called Hallie on the CB radio and asked if he was to get eggs. Hallie responded by clicking the base station's mic twice. Reuben replied, "That's a yes on the eggs. Thanks, honey." He told Joe they used to have chickens, but coyotes broke into the coop and killed the last batch. Hallie wanted to get more. Reuben glided the manual shift pickup through the gears while giving a finger wave to a neighbor he met on the road. The grass was greening, and Reuben talked of taking the cows and calves to the summer pastures. They needed to run the fence line ahead of time. You think you could handle that, Joe? You mean check the fences by myself? Yeah, I'd be sure to draw you a map. Joe's parents briefed Reuben on their son's directional problems the prior year. Joe tugged at his resistal. Yeah, I can handle that. The daily briefing on the AM radio spoke of livestock sales, crop prices, drought monitoring, rising interest rates, western bean cutworm infestations in the Platte Valley, and foreign grain purchases. At the same time, advertisers hawked fence posts, barbed wire, and salt blocks. The segment closed with the daily recipe, pineapple upside-down coffee cake. The weather report did not mention rain in the short-term forecast. A special report mentioned the bounty on the wolfdog terrorizing the calf crop in the area. Advertisers and a cattle feedlot helped increase the bounty, which now stood at $4,000. Reuben and Joe stopped at Miller's feed store for salt and mineral blocks. They also stopped at the post office to buy postage stamps. While his uncle talked to some town folks, Joe noticed a gray two-door car with a maroon vinyl top parked behind the post office. Joe had eyed the sharp cars other high schoolers drove. His family had one vehicle, a 1976 fire-engine red Lincoln Continental town car. His dad liked big cars. He also had the pickup he used for his state job. The American flag on a pole snapped in the breeze. Reuben entered the pickup, sliding a sheet of postage stamps under a thick rubber band wrapped around the sun visor. We better go to Jed's. I need a haircut. How about you? I'm buying. Joe rubbed a hand over his blonde mop and said he was fine. He was thinking about the library in the corner of the store. Jed Foster welcomed the two to the Sandy Slough General Store while Joe held the door for an older lady with a sack of groceries. Reuben said, "Jedediah, my friend, the wife says I need a shave and a haircut." Joe said he'd be over by the books. Jed brought Reuben a cup of coffee and wrapped a barber's bib around the older man. Joe found the library section and started looking for a Sherlock Holmes book. He also found issues of magazines ranging from Life, Fur, Fish and Game, Better Homes and Gardens, Grit, Time, Ebony, National Geographic, Nebraska Land, People, Sports Illustrated, Reader's Digest, Flying and Rolling Stone. Joe found an article in the Flying magazine about a civilian flight school in Oklahoma. He then reviewed 3 Sherlock Holmes novels, Grabbing the Hound of the Baskervilles. Joe leafed through the Grit newspaper, which had a story on a Texas private investigator who, in his youth, lost his hands when playing with blasting caps. Despite his prosthetic hands, the guy later became a well-known private eye who worked for celebrities. Joe thought he'd grab the paper to reread the story back at the ranch. Joe settled into an overstuffed chair and started his book. Jed brought him a bottle of homemade root beer, turned on a nearby lamp, and returned to Reuben. After honing the straight razor, he finished the shaving. He then placed a hot towel over the older man's ruddy face and checked out a customer with a basket of groceries. Reminded them that the store had Braunschweiger on sale. Joe read while half listening to Jed and Reuben conversing on everything from village council news to cooking fish to Kansas City Royals baseball. During their conversation, Jed used fancy words like proclivity, quintessential, resplendent, astute, and predilection. Jed was good at matching his conversation to the listener's mood, sensing when a customer felt down and needed a kind word or riled up and needed careful treatment. Reuben said he had just spoken to Jed's brother, Moses, who was the postmaster at the Flatwater post office. Moses Foster had been a helicopter pilot in the Vietnam War and survived several crash landings. Jed said his brother found a used Mercury Cougar. The car seemed to pick up his spirits. "Oh yes, Mo stopped in today for his morning coffee. He told me he had been up half the night watching the green and purple glow of the northern lights," explaining how a solar storm had triggered the event. Reuben drank from his coffee. "Hallie saw the lights too. All that I saw last night was the insides of my eyelids. The horses are a bit jittery after the northern lights do their dance in the night sky." Joe drank root beer and watched a cute dark-haired girl buy an artist's tablet. The girl's mother told Jed she had an ad for the newspaper. The mother caught Joe looking at her daughter. The mother left money on the counter, stuck her chin at the boy, and said, "Come along, Nanette." Joe watched the girl walk out. She turned and looked back at him before leaving the store. Reuben discussed seeing an airplane and guessed his renter was back in the area. "I'm not sure why he hangs out here as much as he does. The cowboy at the Valentine Ranch also watches the Flatwater herd during the summer. He hires a crew to do the branding. I doubt the man has ever fixed a fence or treated a cow." Jed said the renter, Brody Broadwell, stopped in the store for a 6-pack of Michelob. "Yes, old BB likes to be large and in charge." Jed was referring to the big guy's stature and ego. "And he'll tell you how the hog ate the cabbage. You'd think he was an expert on everything. And oh yeah, John Thunderhawk was here and said he'd heard of a new sighting of the ghost wolf. That caught old Brody boy's attention. BB's a big-time hunter and fisherman, and has traveled worldwide doing such. I guess he has the time and money for such preoccupations. I thought it was called the wolfdog. I can't keep up with the names." They upped the reward. Various entities have also donated money. There's a poster on the town bulletin board. Still not a very big reward for all its damage. Our ranch has somehow escaped any losses. But I imagine it's a matter of time. Reuben whispered that Joe had spotted a large paw print near Cove Lake. Joe stood and looked for a book on mermaids. He found a children's book with clamshells covering a mermaid's breasts. Reuben asked, "Are you finding what you're looking for?" Joe put down the children's book and held up the Sherlock Holmes novel, the Grit newspaper, and the Flying magazine. Just these 3. While browsing the books, Reuben fluffed clippings from his cut hair. "Your Aunt Hallie wanted me to grab, here it is." Reuben reached for a novel. "It's a story of a woman and man who live by a lighthouse near the ocean. I've read the book to her 10 times. I told her we should just buy it." The two walked to the counter and checked out their books. Jed took notice of the Flying magazine. "Are you interested in aviation, Joseph?" Joe shrugged. "A little." Jed glanced at the boy. "Have you ever been up in a plane?" Joe said a pilot back home had taken him up a few times. Jed gave Reuben a look. "I don't normally loan out the magazines. Have them back in a week or so. You can keep the book until you're done with it." Joe walked outside as Reuben paid for the barbering. Reuben entered the pickup and flipped a Snickers candy bar to Joe. "Don't tell your aunt." Reuben set a bag of bird seed and 2 dozen eggs on the truck seat. Joe thought of coming clean with Reuben about the mermaid. But now, he doubted everything he'd seen. He remembered Wyatt blaming his bad behavior on going through his teenage changes. When Joe's high school health class teacher discussed puberty with the boys, he never mentioned mermaids. Hallie hung clothes on the line to dry in the spring breeze. Reuben and Joe had headed to town as her husband needed a haircut. She filled the bird feeder and the bird bath in her garden, hoping her husband remembered to get more food for the birds. Hallie then moved the water sprinkler to cover the rhubarb plants. After stepping from the garden, a charm of yellow goldfinches swooped in for the free meal. She put on her straw hat and hooked a narrow-sleeved cloth case over her shoulder. Hallie chose to take the short walk to Cove Lake, deciding to rest their buckskin gelding Frank. Lucky tagged along. Hallie was born in a coastal town in Maine in May 1910, as Hallie's comet slid across the night sky. She could not speak and had been mute her whole life. Her bearded father, a boatman with thick fingers like ropes, was often on ship save for that last night. She loved her Celtic mother's mystical stories, and the stories she read to her on Sundays from the Bible did not force her to attend crowded places like churches and schools, which brought anxiety and distress to the young girl. Her mother said her quiet daughter was like the people from her home island. Her mother called Hallie's freckles raindrops as she stroked her deformed hands with soft caresses. Her mother's milky green eyes held the secrets of the world. Her face glowed with kindness and love, hair the color of red honey. Reuben brought Hallie to Nebraska after returning from the Navy. She was a tall girl with long, curly ginger hair and no voice. Freckles resembling dappled pebbles covered her face and shoulders like splatter flung from an artist's brush. He was a raw-boned, tallish boy with big hands and a tender manner. His easy smile held her gaze. They married at the family's cattle ranch. Hallie's mother-in-law was a short, dark-skinned woman of Austrian gypsy descent with watery eyes. She doted on her son's bride, and supplied their home with dishes, cutlery, a quilting rack, quilts, and boxes of other items for their new home. The couple lived their first years on the ranch in a cabin they called the bunkhouse. Reuben gave his wife an Irish tin whistle as a wedding present. Hallie wore white cotton gloves to hide hands marred since birth and later scarred in a fire. Let no one see them save for her husband. Due to her handicaps, she rarely went out in public, and she never went out without her Reuben. Hallie seldom left their home, preferring to work in her garden or help Reuben with his ranch work. During the winter, she mended and made clothes, which were donated to those in need through the local Methodist church. She especially liked making dresses for little girls. They had no children of their own. Hallie also made quilts for the American Legion and their fundraisers on July 4th and at Christmas. The morning warmed, and she walked in a steady rhythm. Odors of grass, sand, and pungent prairie flowers hung in the air. As she approached the lake, the twitters and chirrups of piping plovers, willets, and warblers sang in the lake's shallows. A blue heron stood like a sentinel guarding the area. Patches of delicate cirrus clouds floated over the ranch. There was enough of a breeze that Hallie removed her broad-brimmed straw hat, hooking the string around her neck. The heron paid her no mind. She had named the solitary bird. George Reuben had read to her about herons from the encyclopedia. Learned that a group is called a siege but rarely saw more than one or two of the birds at a time. Hallie hiked up her dress, hooked it underneath the sash, kicked off her shoes, and then walked into the water to her knees. She removed her gloves, pitched them back to the shore, and loosened the bun to let her rosy locks dance with the gusts. A squadron of white pelicans swam by, making their kazoo-like and whiskey cork screeches while clapping their yellow and orange bills. Hallie last saw a pelican about 5 months ago, a sign of good luck. A short time later, the scarred seagull flew in, landed on the shoreline, and began barking its mewing and hoo-hoo chants, nodded to her old friend whom she had nursed back to life. Hallie pulled an Irish tin whistle from its slim pouch, flexed her marred fingers over the instrument, and held it to her lips. She blew a soft melody, a way of making noise with her mouth. Reuben was the only person for whom Hallie played the whistle. Dark-eyed juncos and loggerhead shrikes sang along as she made music. George slept while standing on one leg. When done, she stowed the whistle in its pouch, pulled pieces of bread from a pocket on her dress, and pitched them to the bird on the shore. The gull quickly dipped and swallowed them. Hallie looked out over the lake and breathed in all the wet smells from the area. She bent and ran her hands through the cool water, appearing to pray. Thought they'd have the beef stew canned last winter for supper. She would serve it with the sourdough bread made yesterday. Planned to surprise Joe with store-bought Fig Newton cookies. The gull squawked. Hallie threw the remaining breadcrumbs to the bird, put on her gloves, and returned to the home place under an immense cerulean blue sky. 5. Tenant. Brody Broadwell decided to become a cowboy at the age of 40. The sizable inheritance from his mother's family had helped. Life had granted him to be the only son, of the only daughter, of one of the most intelligent investors to come out of Des Moines, Iowa. Brody did not inherit his grandfather's intelligence, but he learned it was easy to make money if you already had money. After graduating from the University of Iowa, Brody joined the family's group of businesses, the biggest of which was a trucking company. The grandfather insisted that Brody work as a truck driver to better understand their core business. After college, Brody obtained his CDL and ran a long-haul route, moving food items and manufacturing supplies from coast to coast. After surviving the first year, his mother saw that he was transferred to the logistics end of the trucking business and then on to marketing. The family also owned a food processing business that made potato chips and snack cakes. As the economy changed, they sold the company. They also sold a chain of fitness centers and a group of hardware stores in the Southwest. In evaluating business trends, the grandfather seemed to have a crystal ball. The mother began a reorganization of the business after the grandfather died. She was sick with terminal cancer and was concerned her son would not be able to manage the family's holdings. She rolled it all into a private equity firm investing in various short-term business ventures and a portfolio of low-risk investments. Brody's mother called her philosophy low-stress money management. The mother would say to her son, "The key is not to get greedy. It is finance. It is not a casino. Slow and steady wins the race." Brody never married despite his mother's attempts to set him up with women from upstanding Iowa families. Caring little for romance, he had no interest in a life partner, in any capacity. Brody would say, "I'm all I need." His true passion, hunting and fishing. Everything. Pheasants in South Dakota, antelope in Wyoming, bighorn sheep in the Rocky Mountains, Montana elk, Arkansas crappie, and Alaska salmon. Then, he moved on to deep-sea fishing in the Caribbean, fly fishing in Patagonia, and exotic animal hunting trips in Canada and Africa. The cattle ranches in Nebraska were part hobby, part tax haven, and part midlife crisis. His grandfather taught him how to write his hobbies off as a business expense. For example, when you visited Montana to attend a bull sale and went fly fishing on the Big Blackfoot River, or a trip to Oregon to see a company about bovine artificial insemination, and you made time to go black bear hunting on the North Coast. Brody didn't make the tax law, he just ensured it worked in his favor. The Piper Super Cub was the best airplane for hunting animals from the sky. The high-wing plane allowed for open viewing. Brody removed the back seat to make room for more gear. He preferred flying alone anyway. The aircraft was excellent at short takeoffs and landings. And significantly more so when you added sturdier struts and backcountry aircraft tires used by Alaskan bush pilots. Aerial hunting was an illegal but addictive sport. While skimming the Nebraska Sandhills, he received a mad rush shooting at any moving target. He sometimes dropped flour sack bombs or paint balloons at the animals below. Early that spring, the snow-streaked prairie side hills made spotting animals challenging. One evening, while the plane ran low on fuel, Brody thought he saw the white wolfdog, but he failed to confirm the sighting after making another low pass. Brody talked to the cowboy who watched his cattle at the ranch he rented near Valentine. The cowboy confirmed that an albino animal described as part wolf and part dog was wreaking havoc on young calves. The wildlife authorities initially offered a $1,000 reward for the animal. Hunting seasons did not apply for this bounty. The wild animal needed to be taken down. The wanted poster for the white wolfdog hanging in the Sandy Slough General Store lit a fire under Brody. Killing and mounting the white-haired animal consumed him. He thought a life-size rendering of the large wolfdog would look fantastic in a cabin in Montana. Living in the mountains was a constant thought, as the landscapes of Iowa and Nebraska no longer interested him. He thought of moving his corporate headquarters to Missoula. The 2-year leases on both Nebraska ranches were set to expire this fall, and there were no plans to renew them. Brody landed the plane and entered the one-bedroom home the owner called the bunkhouse. After opening a beer from the Sandy Slough General Store, he thought of his home in Iowa and his animal mounts, all of which had names. Brody thought of the wolfdog, fearing a simple cowhand with a lucky shot would get to the beast first. He read a magazine article about gray wolf reintroductions to the Yellowstone ecosystem. The magazine also had a steel trap advertisement. He considered staking out one of his calves as bait to catch the animal. Brody had another interest. He decided to read a new book on the importance of white nationalism, which was given to him by an underground author. His grandfather spoke of how the mixture of the races muddied America's waters. There were these so-called Native Americans living in the area. Flatwater even had a black man who ran the general store in town. The guy was also the duly elected mayor of Flatwater. The man's brother even ran the post office. He would have picked another ranch if he had known that black people had settled there. 6. Running the fences. During the evening, Reuben read Hallie, the novel about the man and woman who lived near a lighthouse. Joe, in his room, read the Sherlock Holmes book. The phone rang in the kitchen, and Reuben yelled up the stairs a short time later. "Joe, it's your mom on the phone." Joe went downstairs and talked to his mother, telling her about the branding and meeting Wyatt, a boy his age. He also confirmed his Sunday attendance at St. Nicholas's Church in Valentine, but said nothing about his black eye or the mermaid encounter. His mother said they'd come for a visit in a few weeks. She added, "Your father hopes your summer job is going well. Said to tell you, chop your own wood, and it will warm you twice. I guess Henry Ford said that." Joe said, "Hey, Mom, would you bring me a pair of sweatpants and my running shoes? I need to start getting ready for football." She asked to speak again with Reuben. Joe returned upstairs. The squeak of the front door followed Reuben's muffled voice. Hallie and Reuben walked outside as Joe watched from his window. The two walked away from the house and looked toward Cove Lake, Hallie signing to Reuben with her hands. Reuben spoke and looked back toward the house. Joe ducked behind the curtain. The two continued to sign and talk as Reuben draped an arm over Hallie, who leaned into him. Joe wondered what they were talking about. Hallie prepared eggs, sausage, and pancakes for breakfast the following morning. She had been serving him coffee. Assuming the boy was old enough to enjoy the drink, Reuben discussed the day's plan to check the pasture fences before putting the cows and calves out for summer grazing. Joe loaded fencing pliers, staples, and a stretcher for splicing broken wire. Reuben topped the truck's fuel tank from a barrel. Then he popped the hood, dumped a quart of oil in the engine, and rechecked the dipstick, muttering, "Check the gas and fill the oil." Joe grabbed an Igloo water cooler and the lunch Hallie had packed. She also handed him a thermos of coffee. Reuben handed Joe a pair of leather gloves and a map. The map highlighted the ranch home place, Cove, Opossum, and Wounded Duck Lakes, the locations of windmills, and the fence gates. The deer have probably popped a few staples and broken some wires. You might also find a broken post or two. Reuben found a post hole digger and chucked it into the pickup bed, asking Joe to toss 5 fence posts in the back of the truck. He also set a bow saw in the truck's bed for cedar trees found growing in the fence line. The old truck's been running okay mostly. There is the CB radio in case you get in a jam. The base station is in the kitchen. Just keep calling if you get in trouble. Hallie will come and find me. I need to replace some of the wood shingles on the granary. And speaking of the CB, I need to work on the radio antenna on the house roof. It's looking a little shaky. Reuben learned about radios when in the Navy. The dog jumped into the pickup cab. Joe snugged his cowboy hat down tight. "Lucky can stay with you, Uncle. You take the dog. You'd be surprised how much help it can be. Plus, Lucky makes for good company." Reuben paused. "Hold on." He walked into the house and came out carrying a rifle and a box of ammunition. "It's the 30-30. You shot it last summer, as I recall." Joe took the rifle and looked it over, working the Winchester's lever action. "What's this for?" "You heard about this here albino wolf dog running the country? Or the coyote wolf? Or whatever they're calling it now. It's supposedly all white. We haven't lost any calves yet, but some neighbors have. You get a bead on him, take him down. The wildlife folks have a bounty on him. So, it's all legal. They say he's killing just for the thrill of it. The animal doesn't even eat most of the calves it takes down. But you don't really know what to believe." Joe said he'd watch for the wolf dog. He placed the rifle on a gun rack hanging over the truck's rear window with his rod and reel fishing pole and put the ammo box on the pickup's dash. After nodding to Reuben, he drove off the home place. Lucky stuck its head out the passenger window and barked at Hallie hoeing in her garden. In her bib overalls and straw hat, she waved a gloved hand at the two as they drove off. White towels on the clothesline flapped in the breeze like snow geese. Joe left the home place but stopped when out of view and looked over the map. Lucky curled up on the seat of the pickup. Reuben knew of Joe's problems with directions and drew a careful and specific diagram. He had spoken of how easy it is to get turned around in the Sandhills. The first gate was north and east of Cove Lake. Joe thought he'd drive by the lake on his return to the home place. He left the gate open, as they'd bring the cattle to pasture that way. Deer had knocked out a few staples on the first stretch of fence. Joe replaced them and mended a couple of broken wires and a broken post. He dug the hole with the digger, put the post in, and pushed the dirt back in with his boot, tamping the post with a broken spade handle. He then stapled the barbed wire to the post. After a drink from the water jug, he ate 2 peanut butter cookies and flipped one to Lucky. The dog jumped and snagged the treat in midair. Joe smiled. "You big show-off." Joe drove in low gear while working his way down the fence line. White streaks left by airline jets diffused into the thin, patchy sheet of cirrocumulus clouds rippling through the sky. When approaching the end of the fence line, a turkey vulture flapped its wings while sitting on a corner post feeding on a gopher. Joe grabbed the Polaroid camera and quietly exited the pickup, telling Lucky to stay. Joe readied the camera and moved slowly. He squeezed the button as the prehistoric-looking bird flew off with its red featherless head and neck. Joe smiled and fanned the blurry picture to dry. Joe checked the corner post and found it solid, as was the brace post. He kicked the gopher's remnants away from the fence. After returning to the truck, he poured a cup from the thermos. The taste of coffee had started to grow on him. Reuben's voice came over the CB radio. Hey, fence rider, can you hear me, Joe? Joe squeezed the mic button on the CB. This is Joe. Go ahead, Uncle Reuben. Just checking how you're making out. I'm doing fine. Haven't got lost yet. Not finding anything too terrible I can't handle. Well, I've avoided falling off the granary roof so far. I've done repairs on one side of the building. The north side is in worse shape. I'll let you get back to it. Oh yeah, Hallie and I are running into town later. In case we're not here when you get back. She needs Jed to trim her hair. Roger that? Roger, Uncle Reuben. All right then. Over and out. Over and out. A short time later, Joe came upon the carcasses of a dead doe and a fawn. Joe took a picture with the Polaroid through the open window. A red-headed woodpecker drummed on a lone dead tree a short distance away. The deer were near one of the many blowouts pocking the pasture. Joe and Lucky walked into the sandy depression. The dog sniffed the area and found what Joe guessed was an Indian arrowhead. He remembered Reuben saying that folks may have lived in the Sandhills 10,000 years ago. The next section of the fence needed some attention. Joe then caught a newer model pickup driving through a gate to the neighboring pasture. Joe pulled up on the driver as they were about to close the gate. Uh-oh. I guess you caught me. I was just visiting the lake over there. I'm Brody Broadwell. I rent Reuben's pasture ground on this side of the fence. The man did not offer his hand for the two to shake. Joe got out of the truck. Lucky jumped down and sat next to Joe, staring the man down. Before responding, Joe took a long look at the man. I'm Joe Bauer. Reuben is my uncle. I'm helping him out this summer. The big man kept looking nervously at the dog. Guessing you're running your fences before you put the mothers and their babies out to pasture. Joe remembered the guy as being from the city and new to cattle ranching. Yes, I am. Joe looked back in the direction the man had come from. The tracks led toward Wounded Duck Lake, a quarter-mile away. I guess I hadn't asked your uncle if I could fish on his property. I assumed it was okay since I was a renter. I think I saw you by the lake west of the ranch house when I flew over the other evening. Do you ever fish that lake? Joe looked at the guy's eyes, which often shifted back and forth. I saw your plane. But no, Reuben doesn't allow fishing at that lake. I have fished the other two. Yes, the bluegills are spawning. Never know, a state record fish might be in one of those lakes. I'm kind of a trophy hunter myself. I've been to Alaska and Africa. I bagged a Cape buffalo in Zambia a couple of years ago. The man looked in Joe's open pickup door and saw the .30-30 rifle hanging in the rear window. He stuck his chin toward the gun in the pickup. You do much hunting? Joe looked back at the pickup. No, not during the summer. Brought it along for target practice. You live back east? Well, I live in Des Moines, Iowa. But I know people around here refer to anything east of the Sandhills as back east. Joe looked down at Lucky, who kept its eyes on the man. The dog's right paw remained atop Joe's foot the whole time. He then noticed the renter was wearing sneakers. Have you seen this big ghost dog? Heard there's a bounty. Joe paused for a while. Not around here. The uncle hasn't lost any calves yet. Joe thought of the dead deer and the large paw prints by Cove Lake. After looking at the dog again, the man said he'd better go. Joe removed his glove and extended his hand, and the two shook. The man entered the pickup with the Iowa license plates and drove off. 7. Ghost Dog. Joe followed the man's pickup tracks to Wounded Duck Lake. Initially called Lake Number 7, the lake was renamed after an injured wood duck had taken to living there full time. The wood duck lived in a nesting box on a pole the Reuben made and erected. The duck lasted 2 years until a bitterly cold winter took the aging animal. A new wood duck appeared each year, making a nest in the box for the season. Joe had been to the lake one other time. Since he had forgotten his harmonica, there would be no attempts at calling mermaids. He'd also forgotten his skipping stones. A murder of crows rested on the branches of a dead tree, making angry caws. Joe counted 13 birds. His mother called the number a baker's dozen. Reuben told Joe that 13 was an unlucky number. Hallie made him chicken salad sandwiches with Dorothy Lynch salad dressing. She included Lay's potato chips and a Tupperware container with chocolate pudding. There were still peanut butter cookies left to eat and share with Lucky. He noticed fresh prints from the tenant's gym shoes at the lake's edge. Joe had already forgotten the man's name. An empty fishing lure packet lay on the ground. It was new, with a price tag still stuck to it. Joe talked to Lucky. He could at least pick up his trash. Joe pocketed it, clicked the bail on his fishing reel and cast the line. The artificial lure he used looked like a woolly grasshopper. He let out more line and walked back up the bank to a dry spot. After a few minutes he had a bite, a perch. Joe reeled the fish in, then softly pitched it back into the water. He remembered that perch were tough to clean. He cast the line again and lay down on a side hill above the lake, covering his face with his straw hat to block the sun. Lucky sat panting on a grassy piece above him, its tongue hanging off the side of its mouth. The dog then lay down and closed its eyes. The crows flew away as if having predicted impending danger. Joe continued to run the fences. A stretch of fence in a ravine required replacing posts, splicing wire, and cutting down cedar trees in the fence line. While using the stretcher, an old wire broke and cut his arm. He recalled seeing Band-Aids in the truck's glove box. Told the dog, "It'll be fine." Glad they kept toilet paper in the truck. Plenty of privacy out here. The renter's orange and white airplane flying overhead came to mind. The Iowan's name still eluded him. Joe spent the afternoon working his way back to Cove Lake. After leaving the truck along the fence, he walked up the hill to an area overlooking the water. Lucky followed along. After topping the hill, Joe dived down, grabbing Lucky by the scruff of the neck. The dog winced. Looking back up, Joe saw the white wolfdog drinking at the lake's edge. He looked at the trees, bent in his direction, and then looked back at the truck, and the rifle 30 yards away. The wolfdog stared at the lake and made a high-pitched yowl. Lucky's ears perked up and growled. Joe whispered, "Lucky." "Shh. Quiet." The dog lowered its head. The white wolfdog sat with its ears erect as it stared over the water. Reuben said to take the white wolfdog down if he had a shot. Lucky followed as they jogged down the hill to the pickup. Joe pulled the rifle off the rack behind the seat and grabbed the ammo box from the truck's dash. After patting the seat, Lucky jumped inside. Joe rolled up the driver's side window and quietly shut the door. He ran to the passenger side and rolled up the window, leaving a crack for air. Joe saw the Polaroid camera on the pickup seat. He'd have enough trouble just getting a shot off with the rifle. "Quiet, Lucky, you stay, I'll be right back." The dog replied with 2 muffled barks. Joe loaded 3 rounds into the rifle and stuck a couple in his pocket. His hands shook while levering around into the chamber. He clicked the safety on and took off at a trot. Before topping the hill, he lay on his stomach with the rifle in the crook of his arms, and Army crawled on his elbows and belly. He held his breath. While putting the butt of the gun to his shoulder, he moved up on one knee and aimed. Joe looked down the sight of the 30-30 rifle and breathed heavily. He felt his heart beating inside his chest. The white wolf dog was still there. He recalled when his father let him shoot a sick hog on their farm, having never forgotten the hog's death throes after the shot. The wind shifted, and the white wolf dog turned broadside. Joe saw the scars crisscrossing the animal's white hide. His hands shook. After pulling the trigger, there was a click. After clicking the safety off and pulling the trigger again, a shaky round bounced off the ground 5 feet left of the wolf dog. Joe levered in another round and pulled the trigger again. The shot went over the wolf dog's head and splashed into the lake. The wolf turned toward Joe and began loping in his direction. Joe yelled, "Shit!" He tried to fire off another round, but the gun jammed. The wolf dog ran hard his way. Joe dropped the rifle and took off, running to the pickup, turning once to see the animal cresting the hill and coming at him on a dead run. Joe shut the door as the wolf dog slammed into the side of the pickup. Lucky's paws pushed on the pickup window and barked at the wolf dog. Growling, the animal circled the pickup, baring its teeth. The white hair stood up on its back. Joe saw the scarred lines across the wolf dog's body. The 666 brand on its side stood out. He noticed an iron collar around the wolf dog's neck. Joe noted that the animal was a female. It was big, far bigger than any coyote he'd ever seen. The white beast stood as tall as the pickup window as it snarled and drooled white foam from its mouth. Then, the animal put its front paws on the truck's hood and growled at him like some demon. Joe tried to honk the pickup's horn, but it no longer worked. Lucky barked at the wolf dog as they locked in a death stare. During the excitement, the Polaroid camera fell to the pickup's floor. Joe started the pickup and moved the vehicle toward the wolf dog, thinking he would take the animal down with the truck. Joe revved the engine, and the wolfdog darted to the side and ran. Joe ground the gears and pushed down on the accelerator. While chasing the animal, the truck bounced off pasture ruts, and the coffee thermos fell off the seat, denting the Polaroid camera. After cresting a hill, the pickup hit a deep cattle trail, and the engine died. Joe looked through the dust, but the animal had disappeared. Joe muttered to himself as he patted Lucky's head, "Damn ghost dog." Joe told Reuben and Hallie about running the fence lines and handling the repairs. They spoke about the cedar trees that needed tending this summer. He showed them the arrowhead and told them about finding the dead deer and fawn carcasses, handing Reuben the Polaroid he had taken. Reuben shook his head and said nothing. Joe told them about meeting the renter who'd been fishing on Wounded Duck Lake. All Reuben said was, Joe's tone then turned serious. "I saw him, I mean her, the white wolfdog." "What, where?" Reuben asked. "At Cove Lake." Reuben rubbed his dark, stubbled chin. "Really? You saw him then?" "Plain as day. Drinking at the lake, making a high-pitched howl, real creepy-like." Reuben looked at Hallie and then back at Joe. "Did you get a shot on him?" Joe paused for a while, debating what to say, embarrassed of the missed shots at the wolfdog. "By the time I ran back to the truck and got the rifle, she was gone." Joe knew the two weren't home when he shot the rifle, otherwise he would have had to fess up. "Dang it. He's a bad one. Makes me nervous turning the cows and calves out to pasture." "Wait, did you say it was a she-dog?" Joe nodded and looked at Hallie, noticing the fading freckles on her creased brow. A fiery curl dropped from her bun. "Yeah, I think so. The wolf also had scars across her body, and a 666 brand on her side. And she has an iron collar around her neck. And oh yeah, she's big, really big." He held up a hand to reflect the height of the wolfdog. Hallie and Reuben looked at one another. Reuben explained that the brand was a mark of something evil. He said it was from the Bible, the book of Revelation 13:17. Hallie nodded. She knew the verse. Joe thought the aunt's Bible might better explain the symbol. Reuben said, "Too bad you couldn't take the dog down. You'd have made $4,000. It was the first time Joe had ever thought of the bounty. He didn't have a killer's mindset. Hallie took a deep breath, shook herself, and shooed the two out of her kitchen with her gloved hands, signifying she would prepare their supper. 8. Airplane. They took the cows and calves to the summer pastures a few days later. Jed Foster showed up after breakfast with his three-wheeler to help move the cattle. Joe and Hallie mounted Beans and Frank, and the three circled the herd in the maternity pasture. Reuben had loaded salt and mineral blocks to set near the windmills. There were also burlap bags with insecticide dust to hang near the water tanks. He yelled out the window of his pickup at the cows, "Come, boss. Come, boss. Come, bossy." The cattle followed the pickup as the three herders brought up the rear. The youngest calves moved slowly and had trouble keeping up with their mothers. The grumble of the three-wheeler and Lucky helped goose the herd along. They drove the cattle for a mile with much bellowing by the cows and calves. They herded them to the main pasture gate, which Joe had left open. The cows spread out and grazed on the fresh new prairie. The calves bawled after their mothers, who were more interested in eating the green grass. Reuben and Jed spoke to each other briefly. He waved Hallie over, and the two spoke with their hands. Then Reuben yelled, "Hey Joe, hand your horse to Hallie. I need you to help me put the salt and mineral blocks out and check the windmills." Joe handed the reins of his horse to Hallie and hopped in the truck with his uncle. Reuben banged the outside of his door with his hand and whistled for Lucky, who jumped in the truck bed. They took off as Jed headed in another direction with his three-wheeler. Reuben said his friend needed to check on something. Joe and Reuben had spent time servicing the 6 windmills a few days prior. Reuben and Hallie had already serviced the windmills on the rented ground, which was part of their agreement with the renter. Reuben and Joe shoveled out sand and tumbleweeds that had blown inside the empty cattle tanks. They unhooked the brakes, allowing the air motor windmills to begin turning in the wind and pumping water. An outfit out of Burwell repaired the air motor windmills the month before, replacing leathers in 3 plungers. Reuben said he could service them otherwise, but he wondered if a man in his 70s should be climbing windmills. Still, he crawled up the narrow ladder and stood on the wooden platform underneath the fan wheel. He changed the oil and checked the wheel and tower bolts, raising and lowering his tools with a bucket and rope to Joe. Joe was not a fan of heights, recalling when, after climbing the ladder of a grain bin at their farm, a fast-forming tornado sent leaves on the trees blowing sideways. Reuben asked Joe to throw out a salt and mineral block at the first water tank while he hung insecticide dust bags from a rail held by 2 posts. The cattle would nuzzle and butt their heads on the bags. The white insect dust settled over their necks and backs, keeping the horn flies at bay. The cows seemed to enjoy butting their heads for the dusting. They worked their way to each windmill, doling out the blocks and hanging the dust bags. Lucky was tired and started jumping in the truck between windmills without Reuben's calls to do so. The two also surveyed an area where cedar trees needed removal. Reuben had stayed on top of this problem, with Hallie and him working on different sections each year. His neighbors were less aggressive. He showed Joe the next area of trees that needed tending, saying, "Maybe I can hire your friend Wyatt, and the 2 of you can clean up some cedar trees." The trees were in what Reuben called the fire pasture. The fire pasture name came after a lightning storm started a blaze and scorched 100 acres. A torrential downpour kept the whole ranch from being ravaged. The regrowth of the prairie turned out to be quite impressive, all the more reason to get rid of the red cedars blighting the area. Joe showed Reuben the deer carcasses, who said that the mother must have been protecting her baby. Neither mentioned the white wolfdog. After they finished putting out the salt and mineral blocks, Reuben headed in an odd direction. "Gonna show you the old Van Vleck place. Got a surprise for you." They drove a while, and after coming over a hill, Joe saw an old house with a nearby windmill. Daylight slanted through holes in the roof and broken windows. A chicken hawk sat atop the peak of the house, scanning the area. Joe saw Jed's 3-wheeler parked outside a low-slung building set apart from the house. Reuben parked the pickup, asked Joe for the water jug and took a big drink. Lucky jumped out of the pickup bed and ran into the open side door to the building. He handed Joe the jug of water and said, "So Joseph, I need you to keep this place a secret. Grab that bread sack of cookies and the coffee thermos." When Joe entered the barn, he found himself staring at an airplane. She's a 1928 Cessna West Wind 3. Joe could tell Jed was proud of the aircraft. There were 83 initially made. This one here is lucky number 13. This girl has a 125 horsepower Warner Scarab engine and a wingspan of 40 feet and 2 inches. It has a cruising speed of 110 miles per hour, a 4-seater. The wings are fabric. My father found her covered with a tarp in a barn in South Dakota. It was in mint condition. She's a tail dragger, as you can see. Jed walked around the plane, running his hand along the fuselage. Candy apple red isn't a good color when trying to keep it hidden from the Federal Aviation folks. Joe scanned the plane with his mouth and eyes wide open. He'd seen old planes before, but this was a special aircraft. Commenting after looking inside the cockpit, "It has a stick?" Jed looked at Reuben, and the two smiled while munching on Hallie's oatmeal cookies. "My artificial arm created a problem with me getting certified to fly a plane. Special waivers and modifying equipment were all required. It was a problem, especially given the stick. So I decided to go to Plan B and taught myself. Sort of. And I keep the plane under cover. It was my father's plane, so I wasn't about to give her up. He was a Tuskegee airman." Joe knew the story of the black pilots who flew in World War II. "What do you mean you taught yourself, sort of?" "I took a few lessons from a flight instructor in an aircraft with a yoke to get the basics down. I knew a guy who flew a tail dragger, who showed me how to fly with the stick. After I caught a general handle on things, I said, what the hell, and one day, I took her up. Her name is Stella." Jed pointed to the name painted on the side of the engine. "My father's idea. It was my mother's name." Joe continued to look wide-eyed, asking Reuben, "Have you been up in her?" "Oh yes. Hallie and I have flown in her a couple of times. She loved it." Jed looked over the plane's radial engine. "I checked the tires, changed the oil, and the fuel looks good. I handled a few other squawks that needed fixing." He wiped oil from his hook hand with a rag. "Let's open the hangar door and see if this old girl will start." Reuben and Jed pulled the shed doors open. The plane had to be moved at an angle to get through. Jed then climbed into the plane's cockpit. Joe and Reuben stepped to the side. Reuben told Lucky to stay. Jed opened a window for air and adjusted the switches. After yelling, "Clear prop," the engine chugged briefly, then stopped. Jed yelled again, On the third time, the engine popped and the propeller began throwing sand. Reuben hooked a thumb over his shoulder, suggesting they step back further, yelling, "He's going to take her on a test run." The red plane rolled from the building to a flat piece of ground. Jed parked the plane and did a run-up. During the pre-flight, the flaps on the wings and the rudder moved. After revving the engine, Jed let loose the brakes, and the airplane accelerated down the grass strip. The tailwheel came off the ground, and the plane lifted into the air. Lucky barked. Joe and Reuben watched as the plane circled above them. Jed practiced touch-and-go landings until taxiing the plane back toward the building and spinning her around. Reuben grinned at Joe and pointed his chin at the plane. "He wants to give you a ride." Joe handed him his hat, and with his head tucked down, jogged to the side of the plane, opened the door, and climbed inside. Jed yelled above the roar of the radial engine, "You said you have flown before, right?" "Yup. Buckle your seatbelt. She appears to be running okay. Let's blow the cobs out of her." The two took off. Joe's stomach always felt funny when taking off in a small plane. They circled the area. Joe watched Reuben and Lucky below. The old house with holes in the roof leaned toward the windmill whose fan blades turned in the breeze. Jed said, "Let's see if we can wake up the prairie chickens." Joe then learned what blowing the cobs out of her meant. The airplane then dipped, and Jed skimmed over a long fence line. The plane dropped and climbed while following the hills and valleys. Finally pulling up off the deck, he sharply banked the plane, then leveled out. Joe took a big breath. "Not too bad for an old girl, eh?" Jed flew a big circle over the pasture, including Wounded Duck Lake. Joe saw the pickup tracks he had left from his previous visit. "I've been up looking for that wolfdog. I haven't seen the animal yet. I was beginning to think it was a hoax, but I hear you saw it for yourself." Joe nodded. I was too late to get a shot at it. Not that I'm a good shot." Joe didn't like lying to Jed. "This inscrutable white beast needs to be taken down. You ever flown a stick before?" "Nope," Joe noted. The plane had 2 control sticks for flying from the front seats. "Just grab your stick and gently move her where you want to go. Nothing sudden-like." Joe took hold of the stick and guided the plane. "Now, let's take a slow turn to the left." Joe started to move the plane, and Jed said, "Your other left." Joe's backward disease had kicked in. He corrected and flew the airplane as told. "Piece of cake. Now level her out. Reuben says you're considering aviation as a career. It's probably best to go through the military and learn on their dime. That's where my brother learned to fly helicopters. It's a good time to join up given we're not at war." He asked Joe to turn in the other direction and make what the aviation instructors called a turnabout a point, using one of the windmills as a reference. Joe did a fair job of steering the plane in a circle and leveling it out. Jed then asked him to turn and head back to the Van Vleck place. "I'm a little confused about where we are." "Turn her back west. The old house will be on the nose." "Which way is west?" "I'm not good with my directions. I'll let you take the stick." Jed banked the plane, flying it back to the airstrip, where he greased a soft landing and taxied her to the shed. Reuben and the dog woke from dozing in the pickup. Joe crawled out of the plane with a big smile on his face. Reuben walked up with Lucky. "What'd you think, Joseph?" Oh man, that was very cool." The 3 pushed the plane back into the shed and shut the building's door. They hoisted the 3-wheeler into the back of the pickup and drove to the Bauer home place. Hallie made them a lunch of meatloaf, canned beets, and red Jell-O with bananas. They also had cherry bars topped with a white confectioner's sugar drizzle. Reuben had jotted down the dessert while listening to the daily recipe on the radio. Joe talked about flying in the plane. He used his hand to emulate the aircraft flying low over the fence line. Hallie smiled upon hearing of the adventure. Jed needed to go to the Sandy Slough store for a couple of scheduled haircuts. Joe thanked him for the ride several times. After he left, Reuben took Joe aside and again asked him to keep Jedediah's airplane a secret. 9. The fight. Putting up hay. Lake of the Dead Dinosaurs. Jed, Mo, and John Thunderhawk woke early and spent the morning fishing at Merritt Reservoir south of Valentine. They rented a pontoon boat from Bob Davenport, who ran a full-service marina and cafe. Bob gave them the veterans rate and warned them that the park rangers were cracking down on boaters carrying beer. The morning fishing was poor. John couldn't fish because of his pact not to kill, but he enjoyed operating the big boat. He and Jed thought it would be good for Mo to get out. They kept 2 barely legal-sized walleye. They said Mo could take them if he'd clean them. And Mo, being Mo, never turned down free food. As the day heated up, they returned to the marina and decided to catch a meal. The sign at the marina's cafe said today's special was chicken fried steak with gravy, corn, mashed potatoes, roll, and pie a la mode. The sign failed to mention what kind of pie. John feared it might be pecan, the only pie he didn't like. Customers ate their noon meals at the cafe that also served as a bar. They found a seat at a table and looked over the menu. Bob Davenport carried 3 glasses of water over to Jed, Mo, and John. "Just so you know, fellas, when you 3 walked in, the bigger man in the group at the bar said, 'What is this, a joke? 2 black guys and an Indian walk into a bar. They've been in the area for a few days hunting for the wolfdog. I'm about to shut them off. They've had enough. And so have I. I learned that just yelling at people usually gets them to move on. If they go sideways, try not to hurt them too badly. The sheriff hasn't been here on official business for at least 2 days.'" They watched Bob walk over to the 3 guys, tapping their empty bottles on the bar for a refill. Bob shook his head and flared his hands, letting them know he would no longer serve them alcohol, nicely inviting them to enjoy lunch. John knew Bob kept a rubber hose behind the bar for such occasions. As the 3 walked out, they looked at John, Mo, and Jed, who stood in case the group decided not to leave. The biggest one stared back at John, who turned a scarred cheek toward the big guy. The man spoke, "What are you looking at, Tonto?" John Thunderhawk thought people should avoid picking a fight with a couple of hungry Vietnam vets who've had a bad day fishing. Before going out the door, the big man kicked a chair, breaking one of its legs. They followed them to the parking lot as the cafe's patrons looked on. Jed used big words to convince the men to pay for the broken chair. It took a short moment to get their response. John handled the big one, Mo tangled with a stocky redhead, and Jed ably fought the smaller one without hitting him with his metal hook hand. Grabbing the guy by the nose with his pincher hook and escorting him to the Illinois-plated pickup. Bob broke up the fight while brandishing the rubber hose and yelling really loud. No official visit from the sheriff was required. After eating, Bob asked if they wanted dessert. They all said they would. "You're in luck. Today it's vanilla ice cream with pecan pie." John smiled and shook his head. No good deed goes unpunished. A Farmall H tractor pulled the sickle bar mower cutting the meadow grass on the Bauer ranch. Joe had mowed hay for a few weeks the prior summer, so Reuben felt the boy could handle the job this year. Joe learned that the grease gun and WD-40 were essential tools, as hot joints in a dry hay meadow led to problems. Reuben would say, "Your ears are the most important tool in the hayfield. The music made by the sickle bar, pitman's stick, and tractor should be playing a smooth tune. If the tune changes, stop and check it out." Hallie drove a Farmall Super M tractor that pulled the 40-foot Rouse dump rake, raking the hay into windrows. She made her windrows straight and meticulously raked up the scatters. She wanted none of the hay to go to waste. Reuben had put an umbrella over the tractor seat to protect his fair-skinned wife from the sun, who also wore a broad-brimmed hat. Hallie also wore bib overalls with a light long-sleeve shirt covering her freckles. They all took turns running the hay sweep, bucking the windrows into heaps near the haystack cage. Reuben picked up the piles of hay with a Farmall 706 tractor with a wide front end and a farmhand hay loader. He'd raise the loader, and the push bar would dump the hay into the cage. Reuben would then pack the hay down tight with the loader. He took great pride in his haystacks. But occasionally, after pulling the cage, a piece might slide off a stack, agitating him. He often spoke of how he missed the days of stacking hay with horses and an overshot stacker. The haying crew stopped at noon each day for lunch, which Hallie stored in a big igloo cooler. She usually packed sandwiches, potato chips, and cookies. Sometimes they'd have cold chicken or meatloaf left over from a prior day's supper. Joe liked her leftover hayfield dinners. Hallie brought a thermos of coffee, and although it had cooled by noon, Reuben enjoyed a cup with his meal. She packed a couple of Dr. Peppers for Joe. After the meal, Hallie and Reuben took a short rest. Joe would read from his book or play with Lucky, who spent most of the day lying under the pickup in the shade. He usually returned to the mower while Hallie and Reuben napped. Joe enjoyed sweeping hay. You constantly moved as you turned and spun around the hay meadow, making the hay piles. Mowing was a much slower job. However, He did like the feeling of looking over a fresh patch of prairie grass lying flat on the ground. While sweeping hay, Joe hit a ground nest of bees while pushing a windrow with the hay sweep. After wildly steering the sweep and swatting the bees with his hat, a skid tooth caught a badger hole, stopping the sweep and throwing Joe into the steering wheel. The engine died, and Joe crawled off, holding his side, guessing he broke a rib. Reuben witnessed everything and came over, grabbing Joe's dented hat off the ground. "Those damn bees. I think I got stung a couple of times on my back." Reuben pulled up Joe's t-shirt and saw the bee welts turning red. "Yep, you did. We'll get some salve on those. How's your belly?" "I don't think I broke any ribs." Reuben looked at Joe's side. "You'll be sore for a while. Gonna have another bruise to go with your eye." He smiled. "Young men like you usually bend before you break." "I'm not surprised it happened. It's Friday the 13th, a bad luck day." Saw it come, and Hallie headed toward them, driving the tractor with the rake. Her face was full of concern. Reuben said, "Let's get you treated and head in for the day. We'll need to go to town for parts to fix the sweep. Maybe we can stop for ice cream at the Sandy Slough." That evening, Hallie and Reuben walked to Cove Lake. Joe was recovering from his bruised ribs and bee stings. He'd been listening to the Close and Play stereo and their album with Dean Martin singing "My Rifle, My Pony and Me." Hallie had baked a pan of lasagna for supper, something she rarely made. Surprised, she had the fixings to make the meal, another one of Reuben's finds on the daily recipe radio show. Joe ate a large portion and several pieces of buttered bread Hallie had dusted with garlic salt. His injuries didn't affect his appetite. He also ate an entire row of chocolate chip bars the aunt had made. Lucky followed along in the still air as Reuben and Hallie held hands. Reuben's rough, dark fingers and palm wrapped around her blemished hand like an oyster holding a pearl. Given their age, they knew they needed to walk more to keep their elderly joints moving. Besides, it was a short walk to the lake from their home place. The horses could have the night off. The two often visited Cove Lake. Ice glaciers and volcanoes were responsible for the skeletons at the lake's bottom. The prehistoric bones were why they asked no one to fish or swim there. The watery gravesite was their secret holy place. Hallie guided bones found along the shore to the bottom. She and Reuben had cleaned up ranch debris a former owner left in the lake during a drought. But old rolls of barbed wire still clung to its sandy bottom. Research conducted at the Ashfall fossil beds, 150 miles to the east, uncovered woolly mammoths, Arcades bears, telenovelas rhinos, Mesohippus miniature horses, and the Canis dirus wolf. Bones like those were found in Cove Lake. Whatever killed the animals, be it ice or ash, also helped preserve them. The seagull flew in as the two rested on the cottonwood log. Reuben talked to Hallie about Joe's accident. During his 50 years of ranching, he had mishaps that required splinting broken bones and stitching cuts. The boy was young and strong. But for him, his 75-year-old body would require much more time to heal. The frogs ribbited while a female mallard duck swam by, barking quacks with 6 ducklings in tow. They watched from the log as the hen pulled her ducklings as if attached to a string. A little one paddled hard and tried to keep up. They smiled as the family floated for the haven of the tall brown cattails and waterweeds along the shore. Hallie wondered how such a tiny duckling could even survive. Reuben spoke about how the prehistoric animals feeding and fighting on this ground thousands of years ago must have struggled. For some, it must have been a time fraught with fear. The hard life in the Sandhills strengthened the inhabitants and allowed them to endure even more hardships. The region was especially brutal on the young and the old, and that had never changed. Reuben never spoke about them having to leave the ranch because of their age. The day would come. He worried he might die before his wife. With no voice, she depended on him, but he knew he depended on her more. They rose to walk back to their home place, taking one last look at the still water. The bullfrogs and toads were croaking with full vigor. Reuben spoke of turning the bulls out with the cows in a few days. He also spoke of the haying and other projects demanding their attention. Mostly he talked to remind himself of what needed doing, as hearing it focused his aging mind. Before leaving the lake, Hallie pointed to a long-billed curlew bouncing on one leg along the shoreline. Its elongated, curved beak and 3 whistle squeaks made Hallie smile and shake her head. She wondered if the bird would have survived thousands of years ago. There must have also been gentle animals at that time. Doubted they were all fierce dinosaurs. 10, Angler's Bridge wedding. Rain interrupted the haying season, allowing time for equipment repairs. Reuben sharpened the mower's sickle blades, replaced a couple of teeth on the rake, and used an air compressor to blow out sand and grass around the tractor's radiators. The first few weeks had been productive, and they were moving along with this year's hay crop. Reuben hired Wyatt to help Joe for a few days on various projects. They cut down cedar trees dotting a section of the fire pasture. The eastern red cedar was great for windbreaks, but the tree was a nuisance. The boys also cut down patches of musk thistles invading the same section of pasture. They then worked on the tear-down of the wash house by pulling and piling the sideboards, and they began gutting the interior. They gave Reuben a mason jar with $10 silver hidden behind one of the walls. Hallie fed the boys well with cheeseburgers, fried chicken, homemade pizza, and cherry pie. Wyatt invited Joe to Flatwater on Saturday night. There's a beer party planned out at Angler's Bridge. A kid in the senior class wants to have a bash for his brother, who's home on leave from the army. They're getting a keg of beer. Joe asked, "What's Angler's Bridge?" Wyatt said, "Angler's Bridge is a little place just east of Flatwater. There's an old bridge on a road that's now closed. It's down by the river. Trees make for good privacy." Joe had been to a couple of beer parties, but he had drunk little alcohol. He told Hallie and Reuben that Wyatt had invited him to town on Saturday night. They reminded him that his parents were coming to visit the next day. "I'll go to Saturday night mass in Valentine, then come back to Flatwater for a while." Joe assured them he'd be home early. Joe's plan to attend Saturday night mass did not happen. Wyatt, who came to Flatwater early to hang out with his buddies, caught Joe before he left for Valentine. His friends had already started drinking beer. Joe took Wyatt aside and said he'd be back after mass. "I need to go to church tonight. My parents are coming to the ranch tomorrow, so I'll meet you later. I'm going to start calling you Father Joe. Come on, it'll be a good time. Even the girls from my class are coming to the party tonight." Wyatt said the keg's buyer was asking for donations. Joe thought for a while. "Okay, cowboy, you driving?" "No, now listen. You never know if you might meet up with a filly. Better take your uncle's truck. You might need it later. You know what I mean?" Joe had never used a vehicle for romantic endeavors, but he nodded his head like an old hand at such activity. "I guess I'll follow you to Angler's Bridge." Joe parked his truck along a line of other vehicles. The music pounded from large stereo speakers placed on the top of a pickup cab. They played Johnny Lee singing, "Lookin' for Love in All the Wrong Places." Then somebody switched cassette tapes to play Don McLean and American Pie, and Meatloaf sang Bat Out of Hell. Joe moved through the crowd who checked him out, a stranger. He found Wyatt with a cluster of guys, drinking beer from red plastic cups. "City boy, come over here and I'll introduce you to the fellas." Joe joined a group of high school-aged guys. "Fellas, this here is Joe Bauer. He's from Ewing Way. Don't hold that against him. He's a good hand. He's working the summer at his uncle Reuben Bauer's ranch." Joe shook hands all around. "Come on, Joe, let's get you a beer." The two walked over to the keg. Joe handed over a $5 bill to a guy wearing a gray t-shirt with Army spelled across the chest and a pack of Camel cigarettes rolled up in his sleeve. His large biceps and carrot-colored crew cut had everyone's attention. Wyatt said, "This here is Diggs Tucker. Home on leave from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He's a lean, mean, fightin' machine." After shouting, "Hoo-ah," Diggs grabbed Joe's hand with a firm grip. Diggs had a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You got any ID, kid? You don't look like you're 18. Someone reminded Diggs that Nebraska had raised the alcohol drinking age to 20. Joe looked at Wyatt. "He's just bullshitting you, Joe." Everyone around the keg of beer laughed. Diggs pushed on the keg's pump, then poured Joe a beer, running the stream on the inside of the angled cup, topping it with a nice head of foam. He stuck a chin at Wyatt and talked as the cigarette bounced. "I thought you said some ladies were showing up here tonight. Looking pretty light." "Oh, they're all coming, Sergeant Diggs. It's not like they got anywhere else to go." Wyatt and Joe carried their drinks back to the group of guys. Joe took a sip of his beer. He had little experience with alcohol but faked it. Joe watched as the soldier took a pull on a bottle of Windsor Canadian whiskey. After a while, more girls and other high schoolers arrived. Joe recognized the Nanette girl from the Sandy Slough and asked Wyatt about her. "Nan, she's a nice girl, feisty. surprised to see her here. Her mother can be a real battle axe. Joe noticed Nanette looking his way. A group of girls came over. Wyatt wiped beer foam from his lip. "Hello, girly girls. Let me introduce you to my bud, Joe Bauer. Joe, this here's Marie, Joan, Sue, Kay, Jean, and Rochelle. We are the sum total of the class of '82, if Flatwater High School lasts that long." Joe touched the brim of his hat as Reuben had taught him. Wyatt didn't mention Nanette. Joe looked at Nanette and then back at Wyatt. "Oh yeah, this here is Nanette Brulette. Her claim to fame is she punched our science teacher, Mr. Dumas, in the face and didn't get kicked out of school." Nan took a drink from her red Solo cup. "Yeah, well, Mr. Dumbass had that black eye coming, and he knows why. Here he now works as a hide puller at a meatpacking plant in Sioux City, Iowa, and Mrs. Dumbass has filed for divorce." Nan looked at Joe, whose eyes widened. The night went on. Joe caught Diggs sharing an Army boot camp quote while holding an imaginary rifle over his shoulder with one hand and tugging at his crotch with the other. "This is my rifle. This is my gun. This is for killing. This is for fun." As the music grew louder, the kids started to dance. Wyatt's friends spoke on and off with Joe. He was glad he'd driven himself to the party, thinking he might leave early. But the beer started going down easier, making him a little dizzy. The alcohol freed up his inhibitions, and he asked Nanette for a dance. The group stared at the out-of-towner dancing with one of their girls. The brown-haired girl had dark chocolate eyes set wide on a round face. She asked if there was a girlfriend back in Ewing. Joe mentioned Caroline, an out-of-town friend, nothing serious. He felt the need to say something. Nanette asked him about college, saying her mother wanted her to be an elementary school teacher. But she had inquired about a graphic arts institute with the school's part-time guidance counselor. Nan said she drew pictures of barns, birds, and old cars. One reserved grand champion at the Nebraska State Fair for her charcoal rendering of two fighting prairie chickens with their air sacs inflated on their necks like balloons, titled it Sandhills Boogie. He also faintly remembered singing with Wyatt and the guy in the Army t-shirt to the song Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner. They all smoked cigarettes, and that was the last Joe recalled of his night. Wyatt would later inform him of the rest of the story. 11. The visit. Joe woke after having his foot shook. Things were a little unclear. He had no recollection of getting to his room after the beer party. He'd heard the first hangover was the worst. A familiar voice spoke to him. "Hey, cowboy, time to get up, you're burning daylight." Joe looked at his father. His mouth was too dry to talk, and his head throbbed. "Your mother thinks you have the flu." "I think it's another kind of flu." His dad threw a red plastic cup down on the bed. Joe smelled stale beer. "You're still dressed, so grab your boots and come along, Joseph. You got work to do." His dad called him Joseph when he was serious or upset. The need to throw up grew inside him. His mouth tasted like an ashtray, and his shirt smelled like cigarette smoke. He tried not to tip over when pulling on his boots. The hand railing guided him downstairs, where his mother greeted him. She crossed her arms and breathed out her nose with a tight look on her face. Hallie and Reuben drank coffee and tried not to look his way. "Doubt you're hungry for breakfast. Come along, I'll show you to this morning's project." Joe followed his father outside, noticing Reuben's pickup parked awkwardly. He vaguely remembered someone else driving the pickup home. They stopped by the granary. "Go grab the post hole digger." Joe followed his father to the far side of the corrals. "Reuben is considering putting in a new fence line here. I stepped off 20 posts that need digging." He showed Joe scuffed marks in the dirt indicating the location of each post hole. "Start digging. Hallie will ring the bell when it's time for dinner. You will need water. The hydrant is over by the barn. We'll see you at lunchtime." Joe watched as his father walked away. When out of sight, he fell to his knees and threw up. His ribs still ached from the hay sweep accident. He spent the morning slowly digging the holes, one by one. His father usually strung out barbed wire when he dug a new set of posts to ensure a straight line. As Joe's head pounded, he began to understand the purpose of this project. After moving on to the dry heaves, he made several trips to the hydrant. He doused the big red handkerchief in his pocket with cold water and hung it over the back of his neck. He thought this trick may have possibly saved his life. Joe was sure this was the absolute worst anyone had ever felt, ever, pledging I will, by God, never drink another drop of alcohol for the rest of my life. Ever. I promise, Lord, help me feel better, damn that Wyatt. After feeling his head, he spoke to no one. Where's my hat? Joe dug the 20th post hole. There had been no ringing of the dinner bell. Finally feeling able to eat, he went to the house. Joe walked in as his dad and Reuben listened to a Kansas City Royals baseball game on the radio. George Brett had hit a home run, and the announcer said that Brett was hitting .390 for the year. His mother and Hallie were doing dishes in the kitchen sink. The aunt set a plate for him on the table. No one said anything. Reuben discussed recently replacing the toilet's handle, flusher, and chain, saying, "You need to anticipate in the Sandhills and have parts ready." Joe washed his hands and pale face in the bathroom sink. His eyes looked like red begonia blossoms. Hallie filled the plate with beef stroganoff, wild mushrooms, green beans, and warm homemade bread with butter. She also brought him 2 cans of RC Cola and a piece of cherry pie with homemade ice cream. Joe gave her a thank you nod. The 2 ladies moved to the living room and worked on Hallie's July 4th quilt for the American Legion. Joe sat down, crossed himself, silently said the mealtime prayer, and then engulfed the food. When done, Joe took his dishes to the sink and tossed the empty soda cans in the trash. Before walking up the stairs to his room, his father caught his attention. "Say, Joseph, your uncle has decided not to build that fence line after all. I'll need you to take a shovel and fill those holes back in." He pointed a finger at Joe. "Okay, cowboy?" Joe looked at his mother as she and Hallie hunched over the quilting frame. They had locked their eyes on placing needles with red thread into a block of cloth. He hoped his mother would say, "Let the boy rest, Jim." The baseball banter on the radio of Brett Saberhagen throwing a 94-per-hour fastball covered her silence. Joe looked for his hat but found nothing. He heard the men's muffled laughter as he walked from the house. The day warmed up. As Joe started covering the post holes, he told himself the agony would soon end. But he kept moving slower and slower. Joe watched 2 mourning doves swerving side by side as their wings vibrated, and they made kazoo-like throbs before landing in a pine tree. He told himself, lie down on the soft needles in the shade for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. But he kept shoveling. When done, he replaced the spade in the granary, then met his mother and father walking to their vehicle. His mother looked at him. "You're getting sunburnt. You should wear a hat. I brought you those gym clothes you wanted. I also threw in your football. Your cousin Mary also gave me a letter to give to you. It's all in your room." His father walked up to him. "Looks like your washhouse project is moving along. I hope you won't make it a habit of skipping mass. And your hair could stand a trimming. I understand there's a good barber in town." Joe's dad and mother entered their vehicle. His dad rolled the window down and smiled. "By the end of the summer, I bet your football coach won't even be able to tell you acquired a black eye." His father liked a timely quote, adding, "You know, Joseph, all men make mistakes, but wise men learn from their mistakes." His parents waved at Hallie and Reuben as they drove off. They then went to the house. Joe removed his boots and found his hat hanging by the door. "If I'm done, Uncle, I'm going to my room." Joe found sweats, a couple of t-shirts, 3 pairs of tube socks, gym shoes, and the football his mother had left. He sat on his bed and opened the letter from Mary. She wrote that she had to have her appendix removed, mentioned that her friend Caroline was busy with summer stuff, and that he should give her a call. And oh yeah, on our last phone call, I told Caroline you liked airplanes. Joe lay on his bed, closed his eyes, and didn't wake up until the following morning, sleeping in the same clothes for a second night. 12. Party animal. The meadows had dried, and Joe spent the next week working in the hay field. Wyatt drove down the country road near where Joe was mowing hay. Joe crawled off his tractor and jumped over the wet ditch to talk to his friend, who handed him a Mountain Dew. "My dad says I can lift weights with you again, although I'm banned from talking with anyone else under the age of 30. Wyatt talked while half laughing. "City boy, you are a party animal." Joe shook his head. "Is that a good thing? You'll have to tell me what happened." "That was the first time I ever drank more than 1 beer. "Oh, you had more than 1 beer at Angler's Bridge last Saturday night." "Seriously, man, I don't remember much. What the heck happened? What's the last thing you remember?" "I remember dancing with the Nanette girl and us guys singing a song. How stupid did I get? And how the hell did I get home? Where should I begin? Let's start with the singin'." Diggs the Soldier Boy. Loves that song by Warren Zevon. Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner. I'm not sure how many times we sang the song. The ladies were getting tired of it. How much did I have to drink? Well, that's a good question. You appeared to be spilling more than you were drinking. Then there's the whiskey. What whiskey? I never drank whiskey before. Well, you have now, city boy. Joe took his hat off and looked down the road. What else do I need to know? Wyatt laughed. I brought you something, showing Joe an item wrapped in newspaper. What's that? It's your wedding present. My what? You got married. Don't you remember? What in the hell are you talking about? Wyatt shook his head and laughed. I'm not sure what time it was, but you'd been talking to Nan. She also had a little too much to drink. I guess she told you she'd withhold special relations until officially married. Nan being a prudent Methodist woman and all. What are you talking about? Well, you said that if that were the case, you would be prepared to make a marital commitment then and now. Joe looked at Wyatt as if he was an alien from outer space. And as God is my witness, in front of everyone else at the party, you got down on one knee and proposed holy marriage to Miss Nanette Lynn Brulette right there on the spot. Joe stood and looked at Wyatt. I did what? You heard me, son. You proposed divine marriage to the girl. And it only gets better. What else? Yes, sir. Nan, with tears in her eyes, said yes she would, and asked when you wanted to do the ceremony. Diggs stepped up and claimed that being a sworn member of the American Armed Services authorized him to conduct such a holy ritual. Joe shook his head. You're feeding me a line of shit. No, sir, no, sir. Wyatt held up his right hand. I told you, God as my witness, I observed all of this along with 10 or so other high school-aged idiots. Then what? Well, the gang sprang to action. Diggs spoke of several television soap opera episodes in which he'd witnessed such ceremonies. You pulled the keys off your truck's key ring so you'd have something for the bride's finger. The girls fixed a veil for the bride out of a burlap feed sack they found. Joe shook his head. No way any of this is true. Oh yes, way, partner. You were bound and determined to wed yourself that very night, and Nanette was just as excited as you were. I heard her tell her girlfriends she couldn't wait to have your babies. I don't. Babies? So there we all were. You and Diggs Tucker, the acting preacher, and I, your best man, took our positions on Angler's Bridge. The congregation gathered around. Marie, the maid of honor, was first down the aisle. She carried yellow sunflowers they found for her. Then came your bride in all her glory, also carrying flowers. The group hummed the wedding march. I must say she was beautiful. The whole scene was perfect. The river gently lapped water on the shoreline. The three-quarter moon reflected off the river and gave us just enough light. There was no wind, your fiancé said, standing on the bridge at night with nothing but moonbeams and the sloshing of the North Loop River beneath her feet. Well, Nan said it felt like being on a magic carpet ride. She said just that, and as the service started, a barn owl let loose its creepy mating screech. Everyone agreed that was a sign of good luck for you two and your plans to have children. Service? Children? No, this did not happen. Nanette slowly walked down the aisle. She reached Diggs and you two took hands. You were both smiling like a kid looking at a bowl of ice cream with chocolate syrup. I don't even know her. Preacher Diggs did a beautiful job. You each said some words about your commitment to the other, and you each promised to be ever faithful. You were quite eloquent, I must say. Ladies in the crowd were seriously crying, tears and all, I mean it. You put the the ring, on her finger. Then Preacher Diggs said those special words. I now pronounce you man and wife. The crowd cheered so loud I thought they might hear us in town. Then old Diggs, with a cigarette bouncing, said, You may kiss the bride. And boy howdy, that you did, partner. By the way, thanks for asking me to be your best man. I was quite touched. So I thought it was only right to bring the happy couple a little present. Joe looked at the item wrapped in Flatwater Dispatch newspaper. Peeling the paper off, he discovered Wyatt had given him and his new wife a pair of baby shoes. Yeah, I had to dig around our attic to find those. But seeing how excited Nan was about starting a family, I thought it was the perfect gift. Joe shook his head, remembering none of it. Not 1 minute. What else happened? How'd I get home? I don't know. I fell asleep in my truck till the sun came up. My parents grounded my ass so hard that I'm not doing much else this summer besides work and more work. And if there is time, Pop said he'd find some work for me to do. Joe held his hat while resting his arms on the pickup truck. Wyatt added, I heard one of the older kids say it was the first beer party he'd ever been to at Angler's Bridge when no cowboys got into a fistfight. But there had been other weddings. Red-winged blackbirds fluttered in a nearby ditch amongst the cattails as puffy cumulus clouds drifted through an indigo-blue sky. Yes, sir, it was a great party, I will say that. 13. American Legion. On the third Monday night of the month, the local American Legion held its meeting. 12 men usually showed up. 3 women were also members, but left after the meeting and didn't stay for the debriefing. Post members had served in World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, and some served during peacetime. Jed left the group after putting a closed sign in the window, heading to his house 2 blocks away. The store had a meeting area at the back of the building. The Flatwater Ladies League, the last to meet there, left pamphlets on gardening and canning asparagus. The following night, the Elks Club was on the schedule. John Thunderhawk, the American Legion post commander, led the meeting. Unauthorized guests were asked to leave, but there were only unauthorized guests if Jed was closing the Sandy Slough store at the time. The officer of the day, Moses Foster, gathered all the receipts and documents for the meeting. The commander ordered the quartermaster, Leo Vick, to determine the status of all those standing. The commander then rapped the gavel twice and asked the parade to rest. The chaplain led the prayer, and Commander Thunderhawk led the Pledge of Allegiance. They then proceeded through the order of business, which included reading the minutes from the last meeting and committee reports. Most of the discussion surrounded the event planned for July 4th. The American Legion paid for and placed a group of 3 new flagpoles at the town cemetery, as well as a large stone with an engraved bronze picture depicting the various wars. Under the image, the plaque read, "In memory of all American veterans, this memorial honors all American veterans who protected our country's freedom in times of war and in times of peace. God bless America." They planned to dedicate the display at a special ceremony on July 4th with an honor guard made up of post members. The pastor of the Methodist churches in Flatwater and Valentine would say the opening prayer. Father Stan Kowalski from the Catholic Church in Valentine and a veteran from Vietnam would also speak. Members reported the help provided to the VFW and American Legion halls in Grand Island, Nebraska. On June 3rd, a supercell system spawned 7 tornadoes tearing through the town. Members helped with the cleanup at the veterans' halls and delivered food and supplies donated by the Methodist Church. Roy Spangler spoke about how 3 of the tornadoes had spun clockwise, claiming 99% of all tornadoes rotated counterclockwise. The meeting closed with no other unfinished or new business, and they all retired to tables in the room. Pudgy Soda, the post's cook and bartender, started deep-fat frying the calf testicles acquired from Reuben Bauer's branding. The group referred to them as mountain oysters. He also fried bullfrog legs Jed had left for the group. Last month, Pudgy prepared a favorite, duck blood soup and raisin cookies. The month before, he made 2 crock pots, one with sharp-tailed grouse and dumplings, another with prairie chicken and carrots. Let the broth simmer for a long time to tenderize the meat. He used special poultry seasonings obtained from a cousin in Minnesota. Next month, he planned on making homemade runzas. The group donated generously to the cook's tip jar to support his mission. Jed kept a refrigerator in the room for American Legion use only, stocked with beer, sodas, and snacks. They also had a cabinet for whiskey and other liquor. Jed no longer allowed smoking in the building, an agitation to several. A group of men started their usual card game of 10-point pitch. Reuben Bauer, a ruthless pitch player, was part of the foursome. The rest talked about the news of the day. They spoke of the new law for a peacetime draft where males needed to register with the Selective Service within 30 days of their 18th birthday. John Thunderhawk said he'd talk to the high school superintendent and see if the post might speak on it. I'll bring this up at the next meeting and ask for a volunteer to talk to the boys when school starts back up. Might mention that in Vietnam, 2/3 of the soldiers were volunteers. Between bites of mountain oysters, frog legs, and sips of their drinks, they also spoke of Ronald Reagan's campaign for president and the high unemployment rate. One member said, "I heard the kids had a beer party out at Angler's Bridge on Saturday night. I guess one young couple even got married." He gave no names of the couple. There were kids still sleeping in their cars the next morning. Apparently, they finished off the keg as it was floating in the ice tub. The comments caught Reuben's attention while glancing at his cards and bidding a 6. The card playing and table talking continued for a while. Levi Nobel mentioned a potential buyer for the only bar in town, which had been closed for over a year. Another noted that the school board had begun discussing merging their school with Valentine. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. They then discussed how the telephone party line system was getting smaller and were glad for the new technology. All were glad they repainted the town's name on the water tower in time for July 4th. They also spoke about the farm and ranch economy. Interest rates were on the rise, and they now called the state of agriculture a crisis. Dutch Holcomb, the oldest in the group, drank from his tumbler. They say it's going to be as bad as the Depression. I'm not sure I'd like to go through that time again. You all probably never had the pleasure of vinegar pie or Johnny cakes. The talk moved on to the wolfdog, which caught Reuben's ear. Most agreed they could use the $4,000 bounty money. Some spoke of doing a group hunt, agreeing to split the bounty. Jerry King said he'd lost 3 calves to the wolfdog last week. Paul Cobb, a skinny older man who served in France during World War II, said, "I'll blast that son's a bitch with my Mauser if I see it. It's just killin' to be killin', never seen the likes of it." The men queried John Thunderhawk, who'd been a sniper in Vietnam. They all wanted to know what he recommended as the best firearm and ammo for the job. "That all depends on the distance. I capped a fixed target last week at 300 yards, with a .270 caliber Weatherby Mark V with a Zeiss scope. The wind was quartering from behind to the left at 10 to 15 knots. Hit the target right in the center." He held up his hand like a gun. But target shooting ain't like shooting at something living and breathing in real-world conditions, when your heart is beating like a war drum. The room quieted. John said, "This here wolfdog, she's different than any animal you all have ever hunted. I spoke to the elders at a sweat lodge last week. They call her Honi Sessi, or the snow wolf. Her white body is laced with scars, and it bears a 666 brand on its side and a tight band around its neck. The Lakota scouts on the Pine Ridge had no luck tracking and killing her." He paused and looked at the men. "And oh yeah, she's big, really big." John considered the drink remaining in his glass but left it on the table. "This ghost dog is like Charlie Starkweather, the guy who killed 11 people in the 1950s. Charlie was born poor and bow-legged and mercilessly teased by kids for a speech impediment. At 18, he dropped out of school and hauled trash. Then, he got involved with a 14-year-old girl. He killed her mother, stepfather, and sister. She traveled around with him, killing other innocent folks. Now, someone they call the Unabomber is blowing Americans up. Bloody hell." John paused, and several drank from their beer cans and whiskey tumblers. "It will take great skill to bring the white beast down. I can no longer kill because of the pact I made with my Native American spirits in Nam. But this needs to be done. Order in our corner of the Max-Social-Wash Day needs to be restored." Everyone took a quiet moment. Reuben spoke, "So this here wolfdog is a female then?" John scratched the scar on his high cheekbone that looked like a zipper, snagged the last mountain oyster, and drank the rest of his whiskey. "That's what the elders all say." John then said he needed to head home and asked Mo to meet him outside for a smoke. He stood and added, "Oh, by the way, fellas, I saw a kindness of ravens in a tree at the res the other day. There were 13. It's a sign of concern." At the pitch table, John Johnson said, "Oofta, are we going to listen to ghost stories all night or play duck cards? I'm already down $2 and need to make her back, or Bernice will have my head." The man handed off his glass. "Pudgy, can you topple my tipple?" "Tree fingers. Irish, please." Pudgy responded, "I thought you were Norwegian. You want Protestant or Catholic Irish whiskey?" "I am Norwegian, but Scandinavians don't make good whiskey. Make it Protestant." "Bushmills it is, then." Reuben looked at his cards and said, "I'll shoot the moon." He thought his hand would gather all 10 points, an automatic win. Jan reminded him, "If you don't get duh bid, you automatically lose duh game, and you and your partner each got a fork over duh $2. Also reminded him of the new house rule, if you shoot duh moon you got to go it alone without the help of your partner. Reuben said he knew duh rule. Reuben had several suited cards along with the necessary deuce. The kitty gave up more low non-pointers, along with a left jack, joker, and queen. He buried the non-pointers. gathered up all 10 points saying, "You're blued, screwed, and tattooed," with each drop of the last 3 plays. He took his $2 share of the winnings, tipped Pudgy the cash, and asked for a Dr. Pepper. Jan shook his head, muttering, "Oofta." 14. Moe's Demons. After the American Legion meeting, Moses and John Thunderhawk smoked cigarettes outside the store. Moe only smoked with his friend. John had been worried about Moe, knowing he was feeling down. "I see you got a new car. What's it called, a Panther?" Moses blew smoke and shook his head at his friend. "No, it's called a Cougar, and it's not new. It's a 1977 Mercury Cougar XR7. I bought her from a postman in Ogallala who's going through a divorce. He wanted a little more power to move the 3,887-pound fat cat, so he paid extra for the optional 5.8-liter, 151-horse V8. I need to give her a name." "Sharp-looking car, how you been doing, Moses? Have you been going to your meetings at the vet's home in Grand Island?" Moe removed his cap, which had UH-1 Huey spelled out in gold lettering and an image of a helicopter. Scratching the length of his head, he ran a hand over his scalp. He looked at the hat's front, then placed it back on after curving the cap's bill with his hands. Moe said he had missed a couple of meetings. "It's a long drive, and well, you know." "Yes, I do know. Have you been having those dreams again?" Moses didn't respond. "Listen, why don't you stay with me for a while? Or I'll come and hang out with you, just for a few days or so. We'll go fishing. I mean, I'll drive the boat while you fish. Here the walleye are biting at Merritt Reservoir." John, a trucker, was due for a vacation. "Listen, I'll be okay, Thunderhawk. Besides, you don't take vacation days. You always make 'em pay it out." The two men stood for a while. The streets of Flatwater were empty of activity. John took a hard pull on his cigarette, spitting out the smoke. "Most people have bad dreams about things that never happened. Our dreams are about things that did happen." John thought of his last mission. His commander said, "Send the engine. He'll get 'em." Cloaked in camis and coated in sage smoke, he survived his final bloody hand-to-hand battle with a scar on his face to remember it by. "Oorah." Moses leaned against his cougar. "I still dream about returning home from Nam. I was in San Francisco. I'm in my uniform, waiting for a bus ride. This girl drives by in her new VW Bug with peace sign stickers all over it. She spits at me, flips me the bird, and calls me a baby killer, then speeds off. I wasn't expecting a parade, but I didn't expect to be called names for serving my country. It was as if the Vietnam War didn't exist. They wouldn't even call it a war." John had heard the VW story many times. An owl flew over their heads, and Moses asked if that was a sign of good luck. John said the Navajo believed it was bad luck if an owl flew over somebody's house. Moe asked what he thought of that. John said, "I just think it means an owl is flying over someone's house. But then again, I'm Lakota." While looking up at the night sky, John pointed and asked Moe, "Say, is that your anus?" Moses shook his head at the friend's old joke. "No, Thunderhawk. That is not the planet Uranus." The two stubbed out their cigarettes, flicked them into a trash barrel, and said their goodbyes. John Thunderhawk watched his friend take off in his cougar. Moses drove his car home to what remained of the old Foster ranch. He lowered the American flag on the pole near his house and respectfully folded it. He often thought of the 12,000 helicopters in Vietnam and how 5,000 were destroyed. He piloted 3 of those helicopters when they crash-landed. Evading the enemy still haunted his dreams. He often wondered why he had made it home alive, and 58,000 U.S. service members hadn't. Moses stood outside, watching the night sky. He knew the star constellations: Alkaid, Mizar, Alioth, Megrez, Phecta, Bube, and the Merak. The Milky Way showered its creamy glow across the sky, and silvery stars dotted the black heavens as crickets scraped their wings in stridulation. His heart skipped when a star fell in a flare and evaporated in a breath. He had heard a falling star was a sign of good luck. Moe had been on the lookout for a good deal on a telescope. The Sandhills' lack of artificial light allowed one to see the universe all aglow at night. He felt sorry for his extended family, who lived in the lighted urban areas along the Missouri River. In their yearly Christmas letters, the older ones would talk about how they missed the Sandhills, and often spoke of the nighttime stars. The Foster boys still owned a 1,000-acre section of prairie ground, which they rented to a neighboring ranch. The rent monies helped maintain the fences, repair the old house and windmills, and pay the property taxes. Moses needed little. He had his federal job at the post office and saved more than he spent. A fiancé after the war, tired of his nighttime terrors. He rarely ate out or made impulse purchases, except for used items, and he even bought his clothes at garage sales and Goodwill stores. His brother Jed had helped him apply for work with the Postal Service, starting as a rural delivery driver. A couple of years later, he was promoted to postmaster of the Flatwater post office. He received a weekly check and pre-tax benefits: health, life, and dental insurance, sick leave, vacation days, uniform allowance, and long-term care insurance, and a civil service pension after 20 years of employment. He'd say, working for the government is like being in the arms of Jesus. Moses had no hobbies. He tired of drinking alcohol but kept beer in the fridge for his brother. In Vietnam, he smoked marijuana when on leave in Hawaii, but the grass made him sick. Besides, a helicopter pilot high on wacky weed wouldn't be of help to anyone. Flying the egg beater was hard enough. After returning home from Vietnam, Moses discovered reading. Books helped him escape his wartime experiences. He talked his brother into starting a library at his store. He had traveled to every small-town library in central and western Nebraska, leaving a business card with the librarians, saying he was looking for old books. He had an outstanding personal book collection. Moses had his favorite authors. But how could you compare Langston Hughes to Ernest Hemingway, or Toni Morrison to Willa Cather? They were all good. His mood dictated what he read. But when the dreams returned, he found it difficult to look at a book. The dreams returned a couple of months ago. Lightning storms triggered such things. Thunder reminded him of mortar fire. Moses was alive because of the help he received from his brother, John Thunderhawk, and the counselors at the vet's home. He considered suicide but decided not to do so. But the decision failed to take the dreams away. He tried to keep his life simple, so there'd be no trouble handling his affairs in the case of his passing. Often he felt death wasn't far off. He kept a Colt 1911 under his bed, the fully loaded clip on top of the refrigerator, and ammo in a cupboard on his front porch. His brother's idea was to separate the gun, clip, and ammo, thinking that might delay an impulsive act. This soldier would not give up his weapon. Moses fell asleep thinking of his work, his new used car, and the men at the American Legion. He rolled over and looked out a window. Lightning flash-danced in the distance. He was sure the dream would return. The dream he often had was from when his helicopter crashed in the jungle in Vietnam. Mortar fire and bullets danced around him as he ran through the banyan and bamboo trees. Then, while escaping, he found himself face-to-face with a Viet Cong soldier holding an AK-47 rifle pointed at his head. He dropped to his knees and reached for his 1911 Colt pistol. The dream always stopped there. He couldn't remember what happened next. The nightmare was not a dream. It was a memory, at least part of one. 15. The confession. Independence Day. Joe's parents expected him to attend Sunday Mass in Valentine. At the start of the summer, his father explained that Joe could drive Reuben's pickup to church on Sunday. He told him, "Hallie and Reuben don't attend Catholic services. That is their business. You need to attend. That is our business. When you get older, you can do whatever you want." After Joe's incident involving the beer party and missing Mass, Joe's father asked Reuben to nudge Joe to go to confession at the Catholic Church. Reuben said he was friends with the priest in Valentine. He agreed that the suggestion might be better coming from him rather than a parent. Reuben told Joe they needed to go to town for parts. After arriving in Valentine, Reuben parked near the Catholic Church. "So here's the deal, Joseph. Your father said that you should probably go to confession. I feel a little responsible. So I called Father Kowalski, and he said he'd be around this morning." Reuben shut the pickup off. "Listen, I don't attend the Catholic Church. Your Aunt Hallie and I do things differently." He mentioned nothing about Hallie's problems with crowded places like churches. "I know Father Kowalski. Stan's a nice guy. He's a veteran like me." Joe took off his hat and looked at the underside. He felt the dollar bill he kept for good luck tucked in the leather sweatband. Joe took a deep breath. "Okay, Uncle, I'll go." Joe crawled out of the truck and put his hat back on. Reuben had a stop to make, but would meet him back at church. Joe went inside St. Nicholas's. He removed his hat and blessed himself from the holy water font at the entrance. Joe thought about the confession ritual. He always rehearsed it beforehand, and this confession would require some thinking. Father Kowalski worked on a kneeler resting across the tops of 2 pews. He wore a white t-shirt. His black cleric's shirt and white Roman collar hung over a pew. After gluing the kneeler brace, he wiped his hands off with a rag. A stain marred his t-shirt. Joe had seen his dad walk up on someone in a shop when the person was working on a piece of equipment. To avoid surprising them, he'd whistle a tune while approaching to prevent them from bumping their head or banging their finger. Joe whistled a random melody. Father Stanislaw Jacob Kowalski had served at St. Nicholas for the last 2 years. Having grown up in central Nebraska, he liked serving the rural parishes of their diocese. "What's that tune you're whistling?" "Sounds familiar." Joe looked at the priest's collar hanging on the pew. "I just made her up, Father." Joe stuck out his hand. "Hello, Father Kowalski. My name is Joseph Bauer. I guess my Uncle Reuben called you about me going to confession." The two looked each other in the eye and shook hands. "You can call me Father Stan. I've been expecting you." "Love old Reuben. And your Aunt Hallie is a special soul. She makes a killer rhubarb pie. And her quilts are works of art. They are a pair to draw to for sure. Have a seat, Joseph." Joe was surprised at the priest's comments, given that Hallie and Reuben didn't attend church. A brown scapular hung around the priest's thick neck. He was a tall, muscular man with a tight jaw and hair turning gray. A pack of Marlboro cigarettes sat tucked in his t-shirt pocket. Joe sat down in the pew and placed his hat on its crown to the side. "I caught you working on a project." "Yes, there's always something to fix around here, but I'm not very good at fixing things. My father was a carpenter. He built many houses. I started helping him when I was 12, but the carpentry trade didn't take. I do like to tinker with small stuff. My mother used to say, 'Stanley, your hands were made for chalices and not calluses.'" Joe thought of his own lack of talent regarding all things mechanical and otherwise. He liked this priest. "I guess I should say my confession so you can get back to work. Should we go in the confession box?" "There's no hurry, Joseph. Why don't you first tell me a little about yourself?" A tattoo from serving as an army chaplain peeked below his t-shirt sleeve. Joe gave the priest a brief rundown on his life. 16. Only child. Hadn't been to confession since Palm Sunday. Lived in Ewing. Attended high school, a junior this fall. Played football. Member of Future Farmers of America. Joe spoke of how his family had lived on a small farm but sold it, given his father's injuries. He also mentioned the tornado that went through their farm. Told him he and his parents attended a small rural parish, St. John the Baptist, south of Ewing. Father Stan said he was familiar with the church. Joe said he had worked in his uncle's hayfield for a few weeks the previous year. "I've seen you at Mass a few times. That's what I need to tell you in the confessional. I missed Mass last week." "Why was that?" Joe looked at his folded hands. "Well, my friend suggested I go with him to this party. So, you put Mass aside to go to a party? Guessing it was a beer party." "Yeah, I guess so." "Is that the only Mass you've missed since your last confession?" "Yes. And this new friend and I met after we got into a fight. I gave him a black eye, but that was before the party when we were branding calves. Looks like you caught one too." The priest thought of the black eyes he earned and gave in his day. "Yeah, we're friends now. He told me about this beer party. And I guess what I really need to say is I met a girl at this party. And, well, we kind of got married. I guess. But we were both drinking beer. And I guess I also drank some whiskey. I don't remember it. I'd never done anything like that before. My friend told me what happened." The church secretary stopped in to ask the priest a question. "Father Kowalski, sorry to bother you. Is this a good time?" "What do you need, Brenda?" "The church's Sunday bulletin. The copy machine is jamming up again, and I have a hair appointment." "That's okay, Brenda. I'll take a look at it." "Sorry, Father, but I'm having a tough time getting an appointment with this new girl. And we have a thingy Dave and I are going to this weekend, so I wanted to get my hair done." "It's okay, I'll look at it." "Not to worry. Go get your hair done." Brenda left the church, and Father Kowalski looked back at Joe. "Sorry about that. Important church business." Now this marriage ceremony, was this to a girlfriend? No, not really. I just met her, the girl. And well, she said something about not having special relations with a man unless she was married. And well, we both drank quite a bit. And I guess I asked her to marry me. The priest paused, taking in what Joe had said. I see. I'm guessing that when you say special relations you're talking about sex. How old did you say you are? 16. Well, 16 and a half. I've never done the special relations thing with a girl before. The priest looked at the boy, who kept staring at his hands. So the person who married you, was it a minister? No, he was this soldier home on leave. I guess he thought he could do the wedding service since he was in the army. I see. And I should ask you this. Did you and this girl, how do I put this? Did you two consummate your marriage? Joe looked at the priest, confused. Did you and the girl have sex after the marriage ceremony, Joseph? Joe looked at his hands. I don't remember, Father. But that's everything, I think. The priest looked at the tabernacle and took a breath. Okay, let me see if I have all this straight. This summer you were in a fist fight and gave another kid a black eye. You missed Mass because you decided to go to a beer party where you became inebriated. By the way, abusing alcohol or drugs is a sin. And while at the party, a girl, who you just met, said she wouldn't have sex. I mean special relations unless she was married. So you and her had a marriage ceremony at the party. But you're unsure if you and this girl had special relations after the ceremony. Is that about it? I also took the Lord's name in vain when I cut myself while fixing fence. Do you want to go to the confession box so I can tell you my confession? The priest looked at Joe. Joseph, you've already given me your confession. Listen, you're a young person trying to find his way in this world. Sometimes young people are impulsive. You'll likely make more mistakes. But you should be careful and pray about the decisions you make in your life. A young man like you has the body of a man but a mind that is still young. It would be best if you remembered that there are consequences for your actions, especially as you get older. With age comes responsibility. Joe interrupted the priest with a defensive tone. So I'm supposed to act and work like an adult, but I can't do all the stuff you adults do. Is that it? The priest took in a breath. Doing adult stuff doesn't make you an adult, Joseph. Life isn't always fair. You're at a tough stage in your life. You're too old to be young, and you're too young to be old enough. The priest paused and took another breath. This marriage was not official. It's not official in the eyes of the Catholic Church anyway. Nor am I guessing in the eyes of the state of Nebraska. You didn't fill out a marriage license, did you? No, Father. Joe felt sincere relief, and then felt guilty for feeling relieved. One more thing, Joseph. Drinking alcohol or doing anything that affects your body and mind should be taken seriously. People often get hurt or hurt someone else when they're under the influence of intoxicating things. The priest did not tell the boy about himself, an alcoholic who no longer drank. Listen, I went to beer parties too. Kids are going to do what kids are going to do. But there's a reason we have laws. They often protect us from ourselves and help prevent us from hurting someone else. Promise me you will pray how to handle such future situations best. Joe nodded his head and said he would. The priest caught Joe's eyes. Normally, a priest will give you prayers to pray as your penance. You are getting older. I'm going to ask you to do something instead. I want you to help someone. It doesn't matter who it is or what it is. I want you to help someone sometime before your next confession. Good deeds can be just as addictive as evil deeds. Can you do that, Joseph? Joe said he would. One other thing, please talk to this girl and see what happened after the wedding ceremony. Be respectful of her feelings. See if you two did have, special relations. Then if you want, you can talk to me again. Okay? Yes, Father. Father Kowalski helped Joe say the act of contrition, a prayer he always had trouble remembering. Holding a hand over Joseph, the priest gave him absolution. God, the Father of mercies, through the death and the resurrection of his Son, has reconciled the world to himself and sent the Holy Spirit among us for the forgiveness of sins. Through the ministry of the Church, may God give you pardon and peace, and I absolve you from your sins in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Joe made a sign of the cross. Oh, Father, sorry, I have something else. I don't think it's really a sin. But I need to tell someone about it. You see, I think I saw a mermaid. Okay. The priest had to recall what a mermaid was. I went swimming at one of my uncle's lakes. He told me not to swim in the lake and my mother told me not to swim alone, but I went in anyway. I dove down and found this bone on the bottom. Then I got my foot hooked on some barbed wire. I was about to pass out. I couldn't breathe anymore. And I think a mermaid rescued me and pushed me back to shore. Father Kowalski looked up at the cross of the crucified Christ hanging at the front of the church. He thought he had heard everything in the confessional. It was his first mermaid confession. He stroked the pack of cigarettes in his t-shirt pocket. A mermaid? Yes, and I took this bone from the bottom of the lake. I think it's the mermaid's hairbrush. I hid it in the hayloft. The priest paused and looked up at the cross again. Well, disobeying your uncle and mother is a sin. Who have you told about this mermaid? Only you, Father. And I know you can't tell anyone since we discussed it, right? Yes, I will make this part of your confession, and you're right. I can't relay this to anyone. I would add to your penance that you return the bone to the lake. Can you do that? But just toss the bone in the water. Don't swim there again. Yes, Father. Mermaids are fictional characters. Maybe it was your guardian angel. Whatever it was, I was lucky it was there. Fortunate things can happen if it is the will of God. But we advise Catholics not to believe in luck, as it borders on superstition. It's been said that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. I must say you have had an interesting sojourn this summer. Joe looked at the priest. Sojourn means temporary stay. Is there anything else, Joseph? One more thing, Father, I saw the white wolfdog. It has a 666 brand on its side. He told the priest of the entire encounter with the beast, including missing his rifle shots on the animal and lying to his aunt and uncle and Jed Foster about what actually happened. More sins to confess. Joe shook the priest's hand and thanked him, noting his thick forearms and the tattoo on his right bicep. He left the church and found Reuben sitting in his pickup. Everything go, okay? Are you a free man now? Yes, Uncle. Reuben reached into a paper sack, pulled out a Baby Ruth candy bar, and tossed it to Joe. You should have a treat after a confession. Getting a candy bar would be part of Joe's post-confession ritual for the rest of his life. July 4th came to Flatwater. Reuben said thered be no haying on Independence Day. Joe, Reuben, and Hallie attended the dedication of the flagpole memorial built by the American Legion post at the cemetery. Given Hallie's issues, they stood off from the crowd. Pastor Kyler, who served the Methodist churches in Valentine and Flatwater, led the opening prayer. Father Kowalski read the Gettysburg Address to honor the African Americans who had founded their town. He paused before the last line, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A 21-gun salute followed. Jed had the front of the sandy slough decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. The Methodist church women sold homemade ice cream for a fundraiser. The town canceled its nighttime fireworks presentation, as an errant fireworks display had started a fire last year that burned 10 acres. However, young kids fired off ladyfinger firecrackers that snapped and lit crackling sparklers. Jeanette Brulette, Nanette's mother, won the American Legion flag quilt made by Hallie. A couple of days later, Joe received a letter from Caroline in the uncle's mailbox. Joe, I'm doing well, hope you are too. I'm helping out my dad, hoeing soybeans, and doing other summer stuff. I also got a job coming up detasseling corn for a few weeks. My mom has put up another big garden this year, so I'm helping with that. We got new kittens. Do you want one? I've started running to get ready for volleyball. And my sister is thinking about getting married. Not doing much else. I visited Mary. Oh yeah, we saw the movie Caddyshack with Mary's older sisters at the Neely Drive-In. We hid in the car's trunk since we weren't old enough. It's rated R. You need to go see it. Hope your summer goes well. Caroline, 16. Wolfdog, tenant. The wolfdog considered leaving the area, but the opportunity to kill the infant bovines from the surrounding pastures was too enticing. The mothers were defiant if they caught her stalking their offspring. A recent wild-eyed mother came the closest. Snot blew from her nose as the cow bellowed and hooked the wolfdog with its horns, bloodying her rump. The wolfdog did not kill the bovines near where she lodged. She made a den tucked in a hillside, close to 2 lakes. The location allowed her to detect movement for a great distance, like when she spied on a jackrabbit for an hour before taking it down. The wolfdog felt uneasy. The feeling began with the mortal and the incident at the lake. She remembered the blast from the mortal's fire stick, followed by dust exploding. Her former master used a weapon as such when they hunted other beasts. Now she was the hunted. The wolfdog thought again of the mortal who swam in the lake and walked from the water. Still tasted the salt it left on her tongue. Wondered if she'd have another chance, a missed opportunity. Stars splattered the cloudless sky as a light breeze whistled over the hills. After she fell asleep, nightmares took her to a black lake where all manner of hell rained down on her. Brody Broadwell flew his plane to his home in Iowa, needing supplies to hunt the wolfdog. He had everything to track and kill such an animal. This included specialty camouflage gear, field blinds, specialty scents, deer sweat, buck dander, rabbit urine, and one he brewed himself called panther piss. There were also his wildlife calls, alpha wolf howl, wounded doe, and canine heat hooter, and various firearms. The .270 Winchester, the .300 Winchester Magnum, and a 7mm Remington Magnum. He often used specialty ammunition like the 150-grain partition, and his homemade ammo, 180-grain bullets, and a 195-grain poison-tipped beast he nicknamed the Obliterator. Brody spent the day gathering supplies. He envisioned his picture next to the dead wolfdog on the cover of Fish and Wildlife magazine, or maybe even the New York Times. He'd be famous, never even considered the $4,000 reward. He spent the night planning the hunt. The cowboy phase had passed. The 2-year leases for the 2 ranches in Nebraska were about up. He'd sell his cow herd as that hobby was over. He imagined the scarred hide of the white wolfdog hanging in a new cabin somewhere in Montana, or maybe even Alaska. He'd be there now visiting properties if it wasn't for the wolfdog. He would have stayed clear of the area if he'd known African Americans had settled in Flatwater. He was surprised that the white townspeople highly regarded the general store's black owner. They even elected him mayor of the town. Brody thought of obtaining sodium cyanide to kill the wolfdog, something used to kill coyotes until it became illegal. He would need to be creative to get this beast. 17. Joe calls Nanette. Joe spent the day working on the wash house project. Reuben nudged the building frame down to the ground with the tractor's hay loader. He wanted Joe to cut out more of the salvageable lumber, but there wasn't much to save beyond what they had already salvaged. He recalled his father saying that Reuben's generation was very frugal in how they spent their money. His father offered the quote, "Money can't buy happiness, but it can buy you options." Joe had been wondering how to best get in touch with Nanette. He was concerned about what may have happened after their wedding ceremony. Wyatt said, "If you're worried, just call the girl. But don't forget about the party lines, city boy. Nosy neighbors are always listening in." The priest also suggested that he speak to her. Joe then remembered the penance from Father Kowalski asking him to do something nice for someone. One evening, after Joe had done a 1-mile jog, Hallie and Reuben took Frank and Beans for a bareback ride down the lane. Before leaving, Reuben asked Joe to spread grape jelly on the edge of the bird bath. The two then left on their horses. Barn swallows pirouetted and dived at Lucky as they seemed to be playing a game of tag. Joe was nervous, but decided this was his chance. He found Nanette's family's number in the phone book. Joe dialed the number, and an older female answered. He recognized the voice from Jed's store. "May I speak with Nanette, please?" The voice paused, then asked, "Who may I say is calling?" "This is Joe. This is Joseph Bauer." A longer pause. "Hold on, please." Joe heard the sharp voice yell, Nanette, you have a phone call." "It's a boy. He says his name is Joseph Bauer." Joe's heart was beating so fast he thought he might pass out. He remembered running out of air at the bottom of Cove Lake. A voice came on the line, "Hello, this is Nan." Joe went to talk, but words failed to come out. His mouth was too dry to speak. After grabbing a glass of water, he returned to the phone to hear a voice. Hello. Hello, Nanette. This is Joseph Bauer. Sorry about that. How are you doing?" "Hello, Joseph Bauer, I'm doing fine. How are you?" Her voice was flat. Was she glad or mad? There was another pause as Joe drank more water and coughed. "Excuse me, I wanted to call about the other night. I drank quite a bit, and I'm having trouble remembering what all happened." He thought, what a terrible way to start this call. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, Mother. Jeanette. Can I have some privacy, please? Thank you. Nan cleared her throat, and her voice became quieter. Sorry, my mom is kind of nosy. I don't talk much on the phone unless it's with Marie. I'm glad you called. I wanted to talk about the other night, too. Joe felt relieved. At least she was talking nicely to him. I'm not sure where to start. Wyatt told me what happened. I guess he didn't drink as much. That was the first time I ever drank like that. I didn't handle it very well. Yeah, I have no room to talk. I don't know what came over me that night. Before then I'd maybe had 2 beers my whole life. Maybe it was the 3/4 moon or something. I remember most of what happened, but it was kind of an out-of-body experience. Joe had never heard the out-of-body term before. I remember us dancing, that was nice. And I remember us guys singing that song over and over. Then things get hazy. I guess I started drinking whiskey. I'd never drank whiskey before. There was a click on the line. Nan spoke. Hello, Mrs. Jenkins, I'm on the phone. It's me, Nan Brulette. I'm on the phone with someone. An elderly voice apologized, saying she was sorry. The phone clicked again. Nan spoke. Damn party line. Sorry, my ass. She's always listening in on our phone calls. There was another pause as Nan grabbed a soda from the refrigerator. Okay, let's start at the beginning. We did dance. You asked me. And that was nice. Then you went to refill your beer and started singing that stupid song. I think my older brother has the album. Then we danced a little bit more. There was a slow song. They had a break in the music, and we went to your truck. You really don't remember this part? Joe shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't. Nan took a long drink. Well, we were both doing a lot of talking. I guess we were pretty nervous, being alone and all. And I didn't know what you had on your mind. And I didn't know what to do. I kept talking, and you kept drinking your beer. I guess I blurted out that I would never have special relations with a man unless I were married. Special relations is my mother's term, for sex. I think it was kind of a way of trying to, I don't, So what did I say? You talked about how your mom got pregnant before your folks married, and that's a tough way to start a life together. It gets a little hazy for me here. You were kind of rambling for a while. Then what? Then I think I went on and on about what the church thought about sex before marriage, and then you kissed me. Well, that's not true. I up and kissed you. We kissed for a little while. And I said, maybe we should get another beer. The next thing I knew, you were down on one knee asking me to marry you, and for all that is holy. And I don't know why. But I said yes. Joe looked out the window, looking for Hallie and Reuben. He noticed his aunt had placed a blue mason jar with wild red begonias on the kitchen table. Wyatt said we did the whole marriage ceremony thingy. It was an out-of-body experience thing again. I remember crying. Not a sad cry, but a happy cry. I walked down Angler's Bridge to meet you and the soldier boy who did the ceremony. We said some words to each other. We were caught up in the moment, I guess. We were pretty drunk. Yeah, there's that too. Before you know it, I said, I do. And you said, I do. And we kissed again. They both went quiet. Joe finally spoke. What happened after that? Did we? Did we what? Joe was silent for a while, Oh, that, no, Joseph, we didn't do that. We went to your truck and started talking about something, but you fell asleep in about 5 minutes. I think they call it passing out. Apparently I did too. Marie woke us up and followed behind as I drove you home. I know how to drive a stick. I remember the highway was covered with frogs that night. Marie and I got you from the pickup to your house. The dog was barking. Your aunt met us at the door and helped us out. She is a strong and very nice lady. We half carried you upstairs somehow. Geez, Lord, you're heavy. And we flopped you into bed. Marie said to pull your boots off. When we left, your aunt gave us each a can of RC Cola and a giant Rice Krispies bar. It was delicious. Nan drank from her soda. Then Marie and I drove to my place. She'd asked to stay at my house because we knew we'd be going to that beer party. Somehow we snuck in without waking my mom. But we had a rough time getting through church service that morning. Marie's Catholic, but we went to my church, the Methodist church. We kind of leaned on each other. My mother kept asking if we were okay. I did talk to a priest. I told him all I remembered. I hope it was okay for me to talk to him about this. He's a nice guy. And a confession is done in private. I'm Methodist. We ask God for forgiveness, but we don't do the confession ritual like you Catholics. Nan took a long drink from her soda and stifled a belch. Marie's way more experienced with party drama than I am. So, you know we're not legally married. The Diggs kid is not a minister. And you and I weren't in our right minds. Marie confirmed all this. I know now. Nan took a deep breath. I'm already catching a rash of crap about this. All the kids in town know. I was in the Sandy Sluice store the other day, and one of the guys in school started humming the wedding march. Then the smartass says, "Hello, Mrs. Bauer. I should have slugged him. I'm sorry. Oh man, this is all crazy. Oh hell, by next week another dumb idiot kid will do something crazier, and they'll forget about me. I mean us. Just glad we're not in school." Do your parents know? No, I'm hoping they won't hear about it. I probably should tell them, but I'll roll the dice and see what happens. Joe thought he'd remember the roll the dice line. My aunt and uncle don't get out much. Hope they won't pick up on it. Well, we'll have a story to tell when we get older. When folks ask how many times we've been married, we can say, "You mean counting the one at the beer party on Angler's Bridge?" Both laughed. Nan said her mother was giving her the look. Joe saw Hallie and Reuben putting their horses in the corral. They both said they'd talk to each other again and hung up the phone. Joe did the dishes in the sink to fulfill his penance by doing something nice for someone. Hallie and Reuben sat outside at a picnic table, and Joe brought each a can of Dr. Pepper and one of Hallie's cookies. Joe saw Reuben throw the dog a treat. Baltimore Orioles had swooped in for the jelly on the bird bath. The males, with their black heads and orange bodies, flitted with the females. The sight and their flute-like whistles made Hallie smile. Joe went to his room and read the Sherlock Holmes book. He then reread his July 4th letter from Caroline. Joe said to himself, "I don't have a car. I'll never have a girlfriend at the rate I'm going." He'd have the money for a car if he killed the wolfdog. Except he wasn't a good shot, and how would he ever find it? It would likely find him first. Joe decided to write his yearly letter to Caroline. He left out the black eye and the wedding ceremony, and forgot to reread the letter to find the dyslexic errors that always occurred. "Caroline, sorry I'm a little late with your letter this year. Thank you for your letter. I'm staying at my uncle and aunt's ranch in the Sandhills. Helping out with fencing, haying, and tearing down a building. I made a friend new. His name is Wyatt. He's in my grade. We are lifting weights together to get ready for football. I don't do much. I hang out at my uncle's lake. They have some fish strange, and there is also a strange bird out at the lake. There is also a white dog wolf killing calves in the area. A guy gave me a ride in his airplane. And I found a car I'd like to have one day. It's called a Cougar, I think. Heard that Mary had to have her removed appendix. Hope your summer is going okay. Probably a no on the kitten. But thanks. Joe, 18, the brothers, throw the bone. John Thunderhawk told Jed he was worried about his brother. Moses admitted to not attending his periodic counseling sessions at the vet's home. A customer of Jed's also said Mo was acting a little off. Jed had a part-timer come and mind the store late that afternoon. He showed up at Mo's place unannounced and walked into the house whistling. "Hello," in the house. "Don't shoot. I come in peace." He found his brother sitting in a dark living room. The curtains were all closed and no television or radio played. A dozen books sat piled around his recliner. Mo moved and said, "Hey there, brother, what's going on? Didn't know you were coming over today. Happened to be in the area and thought I'd stop by and grab a beer. Can hardly make you out sitting in the dark." "Help yourself. I was thinking of taking a nap," Mo said, stretching and yawning. The house smelled stuffy as a small window air conditioner whined. Jed found a bottle of Miller in the refrigerator and yelled, "There's not enough food in this fridge to feed a snipe." He popped the beer cap with his prosthetic hook and noticed pill bottles on the counter. Moses opened a couple of curtains and sat back down. "I shut the post office down early today." "Well, you're the postmaster. I guess you can do what you want." "Slow mail day?" "Something like that. I see unemployment is at 7.8%. Guess I'm glad I have a job." Jed drank his beer and looked around. Mo had always been a fair housekeeper, but was also a minimalist. Except for his books lying around, there were few pictures or knickknacks. He stored his collection of books in another room. Jed asked, "What are you reading?" "Oh, I have a few novels in various stages of undress." "Anything interesting?" Jed sat in a high-back chair. Nothing new. I've been rereading James Joyce's Ulysses. It's set in Ireland. It's a story about a couple of guys named Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. I've started the book several times but never finished it. A magazine first published short segments of the book. My employer seized and burned the magazines because they thought they were obscene. That was in 1917, before my time. Does that happen often? You mean not finishing or burning books? Finishing. Many books go unread by their buyers. It's a well-kept secret in the book industry. I usually finish what I start, however. Hey, you see that I waxed my new car. I need to come up with a name for her. You should have bought a Mustang. They're too expensive. Speaking of expensive, do you know how much a telescope costs? They don't give 'em away, that's for sure. Jed took a long pull on his beer. He watched as his brother stood and opened the door, letting a light breeze blow in. Then he opened a window, shut the air conditioner off, and turned on a box fan. This AC is on her last leg. I hope I get one more summer out of her. Need to keep an eye out for a used one. He looked outside. The American flag, which Moses raised and lowered daily, flittered atop the flagpole. Jed considered taking another drink, afraid to finish his beer too fast. Have you been feeling okay, brother? You seem a little nebulous today. You've been talking to Thunderhawk. The dude's got more demons poking at him than I do. Jed scratched his head with his hook hand. I talk to everybody. I know all the secrets in town. I'm the mayor, after all. Keeping tabs on things is my job. Mo returned from the kitchen with a can of 7-Up. He popped the top on the can and took a big drink. I'm doing okay, brother. I go to work. I come home and read my books. I get up the next day and go back to work again. You've been having that dream? What dream? Don't be a jackass. You know what I'm talking about. You taking your meds? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If I'm going to be truthful about the whole thing, you know you're the only family I have around here. And you're the only family I have around here, brother. Do you wish you'd ever gotten married? Yes, maybe. However, finding an able-bodied female who wants to live with a handicapped African-American man in the Nebraska Sandhills can be quite arduous. A hook for a hand isn't too sexy. How about you? Moses thought of his brother's use of the English language. You know, Ernest Hemingway never used big words. He often used short sentences in his books. But yes, I do wish I'd gotten married. I wish I had kids, and they would have had kids, and I would be a grandpa. I'd be a good grandpa. You're only 32 years old. You can still get married and have kids. You think you'd be a good grandpa? Hell yeah. Let's change the subject. You been up lately? Up to what? You jackass, up in that machine you and Pops called an airplane. When are you going to finally let me give you a ride? I only fly in helicopters. You let our dad fly you around when we were kids. That was before. Jed drained his beer. Well, I have been flying around looking for that white canine running the country. So Thunderhawk is right. The white wolf does exist. Are all these calf deaths true? That she-wolf is a bloodthirsty beast that needs to be taken down before it starts taking down us humans. Moses straightened himself in his chair and drank his soda. Sorry, brother. I see you're serious about this subject. Listen, this here wolfdog isn't very congenial. It kills for the sake of killing. And the wildlife police are apparently too busy handing out citations in the state's populated areas to help us poor sandhillers out. Citations for what? Moses shook his head. I don't have to tell you we gotta care for ourselves out here in the boonies. And we gotta take care of this feral monster. Otherwise, it's just gonna keep killing. And it's not about the bounty money. This ghost beast needs eradicated. Mo stared at his brother, contemplating what he had said. He then stood and headed to his library in the other room. I think I have a couple of books about werewolves. Joe recalled the penances Father Kowalski had given him, which included returning the jawbone to Cove Lake. He'd hid the bone in the hayloft but had visited it to take a picture. He hid the photo in the Sherlock Holmes book. One evening, after his nightly 1-mile jog, Joe told Hallie and Reuben he'd take Beans out for some exercise. Reuben said to take Lucky with him. It needs some exercise, too. You've been giving that dog too many snacks. The dog's getting fat. And take the rifle in case you see the ghost beast. After saddling the horse, Joe retrieved the jawbone, tucking it in a burlap sack and hanging the bag on the saddle. Joe had his first flashback of the wedding ceremony, and the burlap sack used for Nanette's wedding veil. Joe slipped the rifle into the sheath and hung it over the burlap bag. The boy and the dog then headed toward Cove Lake. Lucky was panting, and Joe agreed the dog had become fatter this summer. He promised himself he'd quit giving the dog people food. It had quit jumping to retrieve the treats. Joe spoke to Lucky. "Come along, fatso." Joe wondered what he weighed now, guessing maybe 180 or maybe 190. Hallie was feeding him well. His mom had reminded him that he needed a physical before football practice started. He'd been running a mile every night and lifting weights every other night at Wyatt's. Both had increased their lifting reps and the max weight they could bench press. Wyatt had started waking up early and running in the cooler part of the day. Wyatt said Joe should also lay off the pie. Reuben said he'd take the nephew's share. Joe said he liked Aunt Hallie's desserts better than football. Besides, he was a lineman, and he needed the weight. This made Hallie smile. Joe guessed the humid and still air would make the prairie grass tougher to mow in the morning. In the distance, he looked at Cove Lake, hearing a loon making its coyote-esque warbling. An eerie haze hung over the water, but the mist faded the closer he came to shore. The lake reminded Joe of his encounter with the wolfdog. The animal had started popping up in his dreams at night. When last visiting the Sandy Sluice store, Jed talked about the tenant, Brody Broadwell. BB is all geared up to hunt this wolfdog down. Ranted diatribes on how contemporary hunting technology will eradicate the albino canine. Paid money to consult a hunting guide out of Alaska who knows everything about trapping wolves. Joe climbed down off Beans and let the horse graze. Lucky's nose worked as it ran up and down the shoreline. He'd brought his harmonica along and started to play a tune. But there were no signs of a mermaid in the lake. The seagull flew in on cue and began its meowing and hoo-hoo chants. Joe suggested that Hallie and Reuben give the bird a name. Surprised they hadn't already done so. Joe walked up to Beans and pulled the bone from the bag. He thought it odd that the priest asked him to return the jawbone to the lake as part of his penance. Joe considered the bone something found, not stolen. Joe traced a finger over the teeth one last time. Lucky came up and looked out over the water. The gull bounced and looked out over the water too. Joe crossed himself and aimed for where he retrieved the bone. The jawbone splashed in the water, causing Lucky and the bird to start barking and squawking. Joe felt relieved to be free of it. His taking the bone from the bottom of the lake had nearly killed him. He again recalled his foot being snagged and running out of air, then being pushed to shore. Joe sat on the cottonwood log and blew on the harmonica. The bird squawked, and Lucky barked. He tossed the bird another piece of cookie and a piece to Lucky. "We'll start your diet tomorrow, dog." Joe watched for waves on the water but saw nothing. Joe walked down the shoreline with Lucky leading the way. He brought along a half-dozen stones and sent them skipping across the water. 2 skips were the most he could get. Thought of the good stones still in the coffee can. Lucky found the wolfdog's large paw prints near the shore. The dog started to track the prints back up the hill. Joe yelled, "Lucky, no, come." He felt the animal's print with his fingers, wondering if the wolfdog was watching them. He looked back at Beans and the rifle hanging in the scabbard, thinking again of the wolfdog laying chase for him. As if on cue, the sad cries of an asylum of common loons echoed as they swam off to the other side of the lake. It was as if something had scared the birds. "Let's go, Lucky." Joe remounted Beans and tied the empty burlap sack to the saddle horn. He looked out over the flat as glass water. Western meadowlarks made fluttery whistles, and spotted sandpipers made their annoying beeps as the saddle leather squeaked on the ride home. Joe heard a low roar headed his way. The tenant's orange and white planes circled overhead, turned and banked away from him. Red and green lights blinked on the tip of each wing and disappeared into the evening twilight. 19. Tenant on the hunt. Aunt Hallie. Wolfdog watches. Brody Broadwell was on the hunt for the wolfdog. On his kitchen table he had a large map with red X's marking possible areas for the animal's den. Brody asked Reuben Bauer if he'd had any calf killings. Reuben told the Iowan they'd been lucky so far. Brody said his herd had sustained no calf deaths. He said nothing of Joe's sighting of the wolfdog at Cove Lake. Brody called his wildlife consultant again, who commented, "Wolves are a tricky lot." He strongly suggested using horse blood to bait the wolf. The smell of blood is the best way to attract this wolfdog. He set Cora number 9 traps near a lake on his rented ground. Also snuck onto the Bauer ground and set traps at Wood Duck Lake, baiting them with horse blood and meat, shipped frozen via priority mail. The black postmaster commented on the smell of the package. Brody vowed to move on at summer's end, even if the wolfdog was still alive. The cowboy hobby was almost over. He planned to divest himself of his cow-calf herd at the Ogallala sale barn at the end of summer grazing. Realtors in Montana and Alaska faxed his Des Moines office listings of mountain properties for sale. Brody spent time in the general store in Flatwater. The morning crowd talked a lot. He picked up information on calf killings while pretending to read hunting and fishing magazines in the store's library. The store owner appeared to be keeping tabs on him, not surprising given his African race. Those people could not be trusted. Hallie visited Cove Lake. The gull made scrunchy and rapid screeches as she played her tin whistle. The bird appeared caught between happy and sad. She watched a commotion of coots swimming in the lake. The bird looked like a duck but didn't have webbed feet. The coots made rut-rut grunts as they nervously swam around in circles. The wolfdog's prints appeared near the shoreline, and Lucky smelled the fresh tracks. Reuben preferred to accompany his wife when she went to the lake. But if she went alone, Hallie was to carry the rifle and take Lucky. He'd been warning her for some time not to take nighttime swims at the lake while the animal was still around. Hallie leaned the rifle next to the log. She was thinking of Joe. She had watched him grow during the summer, becoming more independent and stronger. Hallie recalled when the young girls brought him home that one night. The young are often foolish. It was a miracle she had survived her own youth. Her mind ran through all that was going on. They had finished the summer haying, and the washhouse project was nearly done. She needed to freeze the rhubarb before it turned. Beans and tomatoes would need canning, and she needed to tell her husband they were low on eggs and cornstarch. Wished they had chickens. She was behind on the Christmas quilt for the American Legion. It had blocks of her hand-drawn prints of Sandhills flowers. The whole process was time-consuming. Thought of the injured Baltimore Oriole she was caring for. What if she and Reuben needed regular doctoring? She wondered how long they could live at their ranch, doing the work required to care for their cattle. Reuben seemed to be leaning toward retiring. She didn't know if they could live in a town near people. They never spoke of such a possibility. There was a lot to think about for someone with such a simple life. The white wolf dog saw the mortal and the canine walk near the lake. She'd just killed a large sandcarp swimming in the shallows. Maybe this was her chance to take a mortal down. The wolf dog thought of her impulsive act when she chased the mortal with the fire stick. It was a reaction after feeling threatened. The wolf dog listened as the mortal made odd vibrations with a stick held to its mouth. Something the wolf dog had never heard before. It made her more cautious. The mortal and the canine then walked in her direction and stopped. She tasted salt on her tongue. The wolf dog crouched in the lake water as the dead carp floated in the weeds. Any closer, and she'd be forced to act. The mortal returned to the log and placed the fire stick back onto her animal. She remounted and stared in the beast's direction. The wolf dog barely breathed as the mortal and the canine left the lake. The wolf dog stalked the two to a compound. The air was still as she crept closer to the dwelling. The mortal started interacting with two others. The wolf dog recognized the mortal it had chased. As she circled the compound, she thought again of their close encounter. At one point the canine barked. The mortal who left the salty taste scanned the area. The sharp sawing of cicadas and the sound of cricketing crickets rippled through the air. As the daylight faded, the wolf dog returned to her den. The sun dipped below the horizon as she chewed on a bone left over from one of her kills. Felt the weather changing. The chattering cicadas signaled the cold season to come. The wolf dog's thoughts returned to the mortal. This one provoked a need to kill. The wolf dog often killed without thinking, but this one was different. A coyote howled and distracted her. She'd been hearing the loners at night. Most had left the area, but a few brave beasts stayed. The wolf dog knew she could take care of them, but those howls stirred the heat of her female nature. But thoughts of the old master cooled such a mood. She would not be controlled by anything again, beast or mortal. The white wolf dog scratched at her iron collar, curled her body, and tucked her nose under. She fell into the nightly visions haunting her soul. 20. John Thunderhawk, rifle training. John Thunderhawk spent the week on a run to the East Coast. He worked for a trucking company located off Interstate 80 near North Platte. Many of John's runs were up and down the four-lane interstates running between Philadelphia and Los Angeles. As an exemplary driver, he made good money. He sometimes caught looks and racist comments from other drivers, but while running down the interstate in a big rig, no one cared he was Native American. After returning from a run, he'd park his truck in North Platte and then go to his home in Flatwater. The town sat halfway between North Platte and the Rosebud Indian Reservation. He spent time on the res visiting his family, frequenting the sweat lodge, and talking with the elders. Everyone knew of John's 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sniper. When asked how many confirmed kills he had, he'd say, a few. Only his closest friends, who were also veterans, knew of his wartime experiences. He'd talked to counselors after the war but preferred to take his problems to the elders at the reservation or his friends at the American Legion. John's skill as a sniper did not transfer to an occupation back home. He worked as day help for various cattle ranches when he and his new wife lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation. They were involved with the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973. They survived the entire 71 days as members of the American Indian Movement AIM. The U.S. Marshals called it the longest civil disorder in their history. It was David versus Goliath, and Goliath had anti-personnel carriers, grenade launchers, and 130,000 rounds of ammunition. The tribe needed his sniper experience, but John was no longer a sniper. One night, while in the swamps of the Mekong Delta, John lit sage he'd brought from the reservation, vowed to the Whoopee spirit, the spirit of peace. If he came out of Vietnam alive, he'd not kill again, not anything. John couldn't be a sniper for AIM, but he agreed with what they were doing. To him, it was a protest, and he pushed the tribe toward a peaceful resolution. It ended on May 8th when AIM members surrendered in exchange for future negotiations with the federal government. One federal marshal was wounded, and 2 protesters were killed. He thought of the red AIM poster hanging on the wall in his home. It was already starting to fade, like everyone's memory of the event. John started truck driving a year later, which provided him with a consistent income. He owned his house in Flatwater and every month sent money to family in the tribe. He still smoked but was temperate in the use of alcohol, a sincere problem haunting his people. His wife, an alcoholic, died when her car rolled 5 times on Highway 407 south of Pine Ridge, South Dakota. They had no children. While on a trucking run to Nevada, he learned of her death. He smoked cigarettes non-stop on his way back home. After the last meeting at the American Legion, members spoke of the white wolfdog and wanted to know what firearm to use to take such a beast down. Although he no longer hunted, he kept up his shooting skills, practicing at a gun range outside Flatwater near the town dump. Reuben Bauer asked if he might give his nephew tips on shooting. The boy had fired shotguns but lacked experience with rifles. "I just need you to teach him the basics." Reuben told him the boy was spooked after a shooting experience when he was younger, saying it involved putting a sick animal down. John said he would train the boy. Reuben added his nephew had a friend, and having another boy his age to train with might be good. John agreed and said his schedule was free the next 2 Sundays. The following Sunday, Joe went to church in Valentine. Before Mass, Father Kowalski heard his confession. Joe talked to the priest, saying he and the girl had spoken about the wedding event at the Anglers' Bridge party. Like him, she was embarrassed about the event, but nothing else happened afterward. The priest told him to remember, sin begins with the will to sin. He asked the boy to say 3 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys and offer up more good deeds as additional penance. Joe returned home, and Reuben said they were taking the day off. "I lined up someone to teach you a little about rifle shooting. Would you be up to that?" Joe said he was. He also asked if Wyatt might like to have such a lesson. Joe said he'd give him a call. John Thunderhawk greeted the boys at the shooting range. The smell of the town dump blew in their direction. John shared his experience with the boys, touching lightly on his tours in Vietnam. He imparted the rifle training the Marines had given him. "I will teach you to shoot like a Marine, but I will show you how to kill like a Lakota." He started by lighting sage grass on fire and saying words in Lakota. When done, Joe, out of habit, crossed himself as if he were in a church. The waft of burning sage took away the odor of the trash dump. After they began shooting, the sage mixed with the acrid pong of gunpowder. The smell stayed with Joe the entire day. John started by showing the boys how to clean and oil their rifles. Joe said his rifle had jammed the last time he shot it, and admitted to not tending to the gun after it happened. John pointed a finger at the boys. "Take care of your rifle as if your life depended on it. We clear, both of you?" The boys nodded their heads. He then handed them each a card and told them to study this Marine Corps quote. "This is my rifle. There are many like it, but this one is mine. My rifle is my best friend. It is my life. I must master it as I must master my life. My rifle, without me, is useless. Without my rifle, I am useless. I must fire my rifle true. I must shoot straighter than my enemy, who is trying to kill me. I must shoot him before he shoots me." John then discussed the tradecraft of firing a rifle. He mentioned the quote about how good fortune often happens when opportunity meets preparation, spoke about controlling your breathing and holding aim. He showed them how to squeeze the trigger using slow and steady pressure until the gun fired. The talk became more spiritual when he relayed the Native American reasons for killing. Then he spoke on his reasons for killing and why he no longer did so. "It's been my experience that when you kill those you killed, their spirit may choose to follow you." Joe wondered if the spirit of the hog he shot when he was younger would follow him. John looked at the boy. "Yes, animal spirits may also follow you." The boys took turns shooting at targets. He taught them to judge distances, as their ammo would only shoot accurately so far. He used the length of a 100-yard football field as a guide. He also spoke about where to shoot an animal. Wyatt was a good shot, and his rifle had a scope, but Joe had problems. John talked to the boys about aiming with one or both eyes. "I shoot with both eyes open." "Joseph, given you're having a little trouble, I want you to try that." Joe started shooting that way. After a few practice rounds, his aim significantly improved. He added, "You can shoot your shotgun and pistol with both eyes open as well." John ended the training by telling the boys that practice was essential. When the shit hits the fan and you have no time to think or breathe, you will fall back on that training, like riding a bicycle, as they say. "But I'm not sure about that. I never had a bike on the res." He apologized for swearing. John said there'd been more target practice in the area since the wolfdog arrived. "I bet the Sandy Slough store has sold the most ammo ever during the summertime." Curious about John's military service, Wyatt asked about being a sniper in Vietnam. John said he'd done some of that and was involved in several Charlie Foxtrots. Wyatt asked, "What's a Charlie Foxtrot?" John replied, but then caught himself. "Charlie Foxtrot is military slang for cluster. I mean, it means chaotic fighting." Wyatt asked how one might find the wolfdog. Joe hadn't shared the information on the wolfdog's paw prints at Cove Lake with anyone but Hallie, Reuben, and Jed Foster. John replied, "Finding this wolfdog will be tough. She's cutting a wide swath, taking down calves in the area. It'd be helpful if someone got a bead where this beast is denning at night. It will require divine intervention from the spirits. We all need to pray this problem is resolved, and that no one gets hurt." John added, "By the way, it's okay to throw up after you kill something." By the end of their training session, both boys had made notable improvements in their shooting. They thanked him for his help, and left the area after policing up the brass they had shot. John headed home, where he stowed his firearms in a gun safe. He thought of saying swear words in front of the boys. In a couple of years they'd be old enough to die for their country. He guessed they knew more swear words than he did. 21. Death of a Hero. Moses woke to thunder cracking and spider lightning crisscrossing the night sky. Ball lightning sliced through the ionized air, sending fiery bolts to the ground below. And if that was not enough, the Perseid meteor shower sent short and long-lived meteorite trails traveling between feathered cirrocumulus clouds before burning up. But to Moses, this was no Sandhills thunderstorm or meteor shower. It was March 1969. The racket and vibrations of incoming mortar fire burst his eardrums as he crash-landed his helicopter, a Sikorsky HH-3E, otherwise called the Jolly Green Giant. He was the low bird coming in to rescue a pilot who crashed his Super Sabre jet. The pilot had been designating targets along the Ho Chi Minh Trail for ground interdiction strikes when the plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Moses felt his dog tags hanging around his neck. He reached under his bed for the 1911 Colt handgun and grabbed the loaded clip off the top of the refrigerator. Wearing nothing but white boxer shorts, he ran from his house, feeling his heart beating as his bare feet clapped through the wet grass. Mo smelled smoke coming from his crashed helicopter. He ran to the side of a cottonwood tree as thunder rumbled and lightning and meteors traced across the blackened sky. He chambered around and held the pistol tight, fearing the gun might slip from his wet hand. It had happened to him before. Moses ran to the barn and ducked inside the door. He heard the pilot's cry for help. Medic. Medic. He looked up as a rumble thumped across the sky. Prayed the high bird was coming to rescue them, but remembered he never had time to get a mayday call off before going down. Where were the other guys on his chopper? More screams. I need help. While running to the granary, his bare feet slipped on the wet sand, and he fell. Mortar fire flashed, and Moses saw a Viet Cong soldier standing over him with the barrel of his AK-47 lowering. It all happened in slow motion. As Moses raised his 1911 at the VC, a bolt of lightning snapped from the Nebraska sky, carrying its electrical charge down the pistol barrel to Mo's hand and arm, tracing its way to his heart and exploding through his left armpit. Wartime terrors would no longer haunt this Vietnam helicopter pilot. The following day, Jed noted that his brother didn't show up for his morning coffee. An older lady stopped at the Sandy Slough store and said, "Your brother didn't show up for work today." Jed had received notices about his brother like this before, but today, he knew at that instant his brother was gone. Last night, he woke to thunder, and his room lit up from the sharp lightning. Feeling nauseous, he went to the toilet and threw up. His chest felt like there was a hole in it. Lying back in his bed, he laughed it off, blaming the feeling on the bluegill and perch fillets from the night's supper. Jed called the sheriff and left the store. A double rainbow decorated the early morning sky. He parked his pickup and ran to Mo's house, finding the door open. Jed looked but could not find his brother. He went outside and looked in the cougar. He then saw Moses lying on the sand between the barn and the granary. He was in his underwear, and a pistol lay off to the side. Its barrel looked as if it had exploded. He knelt and touched his brother's scorched chest. The American flag snapped in the sharp Sandhills breeze. Moses forgot to lower the flag the night before. The sheriff had witnessed many lightning strikes, but this was the first time a human was involved. The telephone party line spoke of several dead cattle from last night's lightning storm. He told Jed what he surmised of how his brother had died. Jed was left to discern the rest. After everything Moses had been through, he ended up lying on the ground dead after a Nebraska lightning storm. John Thunderhawk received a message from Jed via the trucking company. He dropped his empty trailer at the nearest truck stop and bobtailed back to Flatwater. He prayed to his spirits while smoking cigarettes all the way home. After returning to Flatwater, he spoke to Jed at the store, finding him shaken. Jed asked him for help handling the American Legion part of the funeral. He said the pastor at the Methodist church would lead the funeral service. John then drove to Mo's place and lowered the American flag to half-staff. He saluted, said a Lakota prayer, and went home. The Foster family cemetery on the ranch had been there since the early 1900s. Various relatives, including Jed and Moses's parents, were buried there. The father died from sickle cell anemia when the boys were teenagers. The mother died from ovarian cancer after Mo returned from Vietnam. Maybe this was why Moses expected to die young. An honor guard, made up of members of the Flatwater American Legion, was present for his funeral. They draped an American flag over his casket. Pastor Kyler from the Methodist Church gave a moving sermon. He spoke about how Moses Foster had earned 8 air medals, including the Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 Bronze Stars. Members of the Foster family, now living in Omaha and Kansas City, were also present. Joe and Wyatt sat by each other during the funeral. It was a sad day, and Joe had trouble keeping from crying. He saw Reuben holding a handkerchief. The Bauers were all easy criers. The Flatwater American Legion post and visiting military members, including a Marine Corps chaplain, were at the graveside. Local post members folded the flag, and John Thunderhawk presented it to Jed. Several mourners jerked after the honor guard fired their rifles. The chaplain played taps as tears fell throughout the crowd. Joe heard a rumble coming from the distance and feared it was the renter up in his plane looking for the damn wolfdog. But instead, a Huey helicopter did a flyover. John Thunderhawk had arranged for that as well. The community brought food and picnic tables to the Foster Ranch for the potluck meal after the burial. Hallie, a workhorse in the kitchen, helped with the meal. She focused on the work to handle the large crowd of people. People lingered, taking advantage of this time to catch up with their neighbors. Joe, his aunt, and his uncle then headed home. Reuben, extra quiet, finally spoke. Poor Jedediah. You know, the war killed his brother, not lightning. 22. End of summer. The hay season was over, and Reuben and Joe were cleaning up the equipment. Reuben hauled a couple of haystacks into the stack yard near the house. They made for an excellent windbreak during the winter. Reuben agreed to sell a portion of the hay crop to a neighbor interested in renting his ground the following year. The neighbor's son graduated from college and was getting married. He and his new wife had decided to move back home. The neighbor wondered if Reuben would also be interested in selling his black mother cows. The neighbor's entire herd was made up of Angus cattle. They could also help with putting up hay the following summer for shares. Asked if he had ever considered putting up hay with a large round hay baler instead of in stacks. Reuben had heard on the radio that most ranches were moving in this direction. He guessed the neighbor's son enjoyed ranching. But did he and his bride understand all that would be required of them? Joe finished tearing down the washhouse, placing the salvaged lumber in the pole barn where Reuben stored the haying equipment. He shoved piles of leftover debris into one big heap. Reuben planned to burn the pile after a good snowfall. Joe could tell running and lifting weights had helped him get stronger this summer. The ranch work of fixing fences, removing cedar trees, and tearing down the washhouse also helped. This year, he'd be ready for the football season. He had lost touch with his classmates over the summer and looked forward to moving back home. Joe took evening trips out to Cove Lake. His stone skipping had improved, and he could now get a rock to bounce 3 times. But he only had one stone left, and it was a good one. When visiting the lake, he brought the rifle and Lucky with him as Reuben instructed. They tried to track the wolfdog's prints from the lake, but following a trail over Sandhills prairie grass was almost impossible. Joe often had a creepy feeling the beast was watching them. Lucky would sometimes stop, look around, and growl, giving Joe the shivers. He'd return to the home place after such a feeling. Summer was coming to an end. Joe had talked to his mother, and they planned to pick him up on Friday. The following Monday, 2-a-day football practice started. Joe had his sports physical done at the hospital in Valentine. School classes started the Monday after. After finishing the washhouse, Joe took it upon himself to refurbish the outhouse. He found a gallon of white paint in the granary. Wearing his old gym shoes, he scraped and then painted the toilet. He used lumber saved from the washhouse demolition and made repairs. Reuben gave a big smile after seeing what Joe had accomplished. They found leftover wood shingles, and the two put a new cover on the outhouse roof. Reuben tacked a horseshoe near the front peak, telling Joe the open end should be at the top for good luck. Hallie painted a crescent moon on the front door, and colorful flowers on the side. Reuben jokingly commented that the flowers might improve the privy's smell. Joe also gave Lucky a much-needed bath, which pleased Hallie. On his last visit to Cove Lake that summer, Joe thought of the barbed wire scars on his foot and leg from when he nearly drowned. He then thought of being chased by the white wolfdog. Twice he almost died. His friends back home in Ewing would never believe him. The seagull greeted him as usual. Joe played his harmonica but saw no big waves. He thought of Father Kowalski, who told him responsibility comes with age. Joe grabbed the perfect skipping stone from his pocket, feeling its smooth, symmetrical shape. Then he threw it overhand as far as he could, barely hearing the stone bloop in the water. He was getting too old to skip stones. Joe then pulled out the arrowhead he had found in the blowout, which he had carried for good luck. He thought of the priest's talk about superstitions. Oh well, one more. He sent the petrified stone skidding across the lake. Joe heard Jed was selling his brother's Mercury Cougar XR7, but he doubted he could afford it. Maybe his uncle would pay him a little for the summer, or his parents would loan him the money, as he had nothing in his savings account. He also thought of branding calves and exchanging black eyes with Wyatt, the season in the hayfield, fixing fence, lifting weights, and getting married on Angler's Bridge at the beer party. Joe said goodbye to the gull, flicking at the last pieces of bread. After removing his hat, he wiped his forehead and said goodbye to Cove Lake as the birds and frogs chattered. He had already decided on whether the mermaid existed. Before putting his hat back on, he rolled it in his hand, noting the sweat, dirt, and grease stains. The summer haying had dulled the resistal's white sheen. He tried to straighten a couple of dents, pulled the lucky dollar from the hat's leather sweatband, put it in his pocket, and put the hat back on. Joe noticed the wolfdog's prints near the shoreline and felt the .30-30 rifle tucked into the sheath. A feeling that the beast was watching crept over him. Even Lucky's hair stood on end while it looked around and lowly barked. After scanning the lake one last time, he rode back to the home place. Brody Broadwell was fed up trying to find the wolfdog and wondered if it even existed. But he had discovered his trap set off and the horse bait stolen. His plane had begun to have mechanical issues as he'd been running it hard. He took her up one last time, scouring the area around the Bauer ranch. Then, at last, he finally spotted the white wolfdog loping through a pasture. Brody felt his heart beating as he flew his plane low, opened a side window, and tried to shoot the dog with a .44 caliber pistol. His shaky shots were not close. The engine chugged on his third low pass at the animal, and the plane went down. After a hard landing, the Piper hit a deep blowout, and the aircraft flipped over. Brody crawled from the plane. He'd wrenched his back and neck. No sign of the wolfdog. He immediately swore he'd never return to the Sandhills. Ever. 23. Prayer Warriors. Father Kowalski went to St. Nicholas's for his morning prayers. He said a rosary and meditated on the needs of his parish. He'd been thinking of the young man, Joe Bauer, the visitor to their church on a summer sojourn. He rarely thought of prior confessions, having been taught in the seminary to treat them when done as if you were blowing out a candle. However, this one reminded him a little of his own carefree youth. The young either lived in fear or had little fear of sincere danger. But Father Kowalski knew evil existed around every corner. The fight between good and evil has lasted since Adam and Eve. He thought of the boy's telling of his scary encounter with the white wolfdog, with the 666 brand on its side. He spoke out loud the Bible quote from the book of Revelation that referred to the apocalyptic mark of the beast. Here is wisdom. He that hath understanding, let him count the number of the beast. For it is the number of a man, and the number of him is 666. The priest thought of the words from the Lord's Prayer, and deliver us from evil. The priest crossed himself and prayed. The prayer against every evil, Spirit of our God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Most Holy Trinity, Immaculate Virgin Mary, angels, archangels, and saints of heaven, descend upon Joseph. Please purify him, Lord, mold him, fill him with yourself. Banish all the forces of evil who may attack Joseph. Destroy them, defeat them, so he can be healthy and do good deeds. The wolfdog watched the living sight of the pack of three. After another near miss the day before, she needed to remain guarded. Each morning, the wolfdog watched as the three started their day. One removed a dwelling and stacked the pieces. Another worked on the implements. Then, there was the mortal whose smell left a taste of salt on her tongue. If the wolfdog could take one of these beings down, it would be that one. She watched the mortal hang covers on a line and dig in the patch near the dwelling. The mortal would walk or ride the horse to the lake daily. They always carried the fire stick, and the canine always followed. The wolfdog was so intent on studying its prey that she forgot to eat. Jed did not sleep, still troubled by the loss of his brother. The guilt overwhelmed him. At night, he looked over pictures of his parents hanging on the walls of his home. His father, Raymond, an infant in 1917, a family reunion photo in 1931, a fighter pilot in Italy in 1946, baling hay in 1950, a Father's Day photo with his two boys in 1958. His mother, Stella, a stair-step photo collage. Stella, a child in a flower print dress at church, her high school graduation, holding a baby with a second one on her leg. She and two boys wading in a cattle water tank, a fading waif of a figure in a hospital bed trying to smile. A photo of side-by-side grave markers. He called a part-timer and asked if they would work at the store while he went to church. Jed sat in a pew contemplating his brother's death, but his mind rambled. He remembered his mother told him Jedediah meant beloved of the Lord. For some reason, he also remembered John Lennon's quote, "Life is what happens when you are busy making other plans." He recalled the funeral dinner and speaking to John Thunderhawk. They felt guilty about Moses's death. Both wondered what else they could have done. The fact his death wasn't a suicide gave them a little solace. Jed recalled Reuben Bauer hugging him. His nephew Joe shook his hand while at the cemetery and told him he was sorry for his loss. He noted the kid had grown over the summer. Joe and his friend Wyatt talked with Jed and John at the funeral dinner. They spoke of the upcoming football season and their maximum bench presses for the summer. The boys thanked John again for his rifle training. The hope and joy of youth, Jed's father would often say. Jed prayed for boys like Joe and Wyatt, remembering losing his arm when he was young. A stupid mistake can change a life forever. He thought of them taking shooting lessons from John Thunderhawk. Life on the Great Plains kept repeating itself. Jed remembered the Bible reading his mother helped him, and his brother commit to memory. She called the verse the Sandhills Psalm because of its references to tranquil water, green pastures, and valleys. The Lord is my shepherd. I will not be in need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The wolfdog's intense desire to kill the mortal welled inside her. It was as if a dark spirit had decided what she should do. It would be done and over at the mortal's next visit to the water, but the next time at the lake, the mortal was not alone. One of the other mortals accompanied her, and they'd ridden their animals. After a time, they returned to their compound. The wolfdog followed and lay wait. She'd prefer this done near water. But the wolfdog could wait no longer. John Thunderhawk visited Moe's place. He missed his friend, still saddened by the tragic loss. He brought a fire ring made from an old metal barrel, placed it where they found Moe's body, and stacked firewood inside. He removed his hat and put on face paint, covering his scar with a red streak, and started sage on fire. After inhaling the smoke, he quoted from the book, Black Elk Speaks, "The world you see is happier after the terror of the storm." John Thunderhawk mixed the burning sage with the wood. On the windless day, the smoke drifted straight upward. He removed his shirt and put on his Native American dress. Looking up at the morning sky, he took hold of a drum, beat steadily, and danced and chanted around the fire ring. The ghost dance reunited the living with the dead and brought their spirits to fight on their behalf. He sang a native songscape, a Lakota prayer to the Great Spirit, Wakan Tanka, to ward off all evil. 24. Squeeze the trigger. Life flight. Joe returned home on beans after checking on an injured bull they had returned to the bull pasture. He spotted Hallie carrying a slop bucket behind the barn. She'd been busy canning her garden's tomatoes, carrots, and green beans. Before leaving in the pickup, Reuben stopped and rolled the window down. Joe told him the bull's limp was getting worse. Reuben rested his arm on the door. Probably need to take the old boy to the meat-packing plant. His time has come. I'm going to town as we're out of butter and flour. And apparently, your last big meal requires both ingredients, those and ice cream. Or so my wife has informed me. I better buy extra. Oh, and I grabbed your pile of books and magazines to return to Jed's library. I found a Polaroid and left it on your bed. He drove off with the radio blaring the morning crop and livestock reports. Joe rode up to the barn, thinking of family and friends in Ewing. He'd miss Wyatt. Suddenly, Beans pulled up short. Joe grabbed the saddle horn and pinched his legs to keep from falling. The horse stamped her hooves and snorted. Joe thought, what the hell? A low growl came from behind the barn. He booted Beans forward. Come on, Beans. They moved through the gate. Joe found the white wolfdog staring Hallie down. She held a gloved hand in front of her and the other to her chest. White foam ran from the growling wolfdog's mouth. Joe saw the fangs he'd seen on the day she chased him into the pickup. Lucky started barking. The wolfdog took no notice of them. The horse blew air from its nostrils and made guttural bubbling noises while it stamped and turned and twisted. Joe pulled the rifle from the scabbard. It hung up in the reins. He freed it, clicked the safety off, levered it around, and leveled the gun at the wolfdog. Hallie was in the way of getting a clear shot. Joe closed his boot on Bean's left flank and opened the right rein. The horse side-passed toward the corral fence. The huge wolfdog's head lowered as she crept toward Hallie, who walked backward. It all happened in slow motion. Joe put the reins in his teeth as the horse's movements jostled his aim. The wolfdog dipped its nose down and crept closer. The animal's neck was so swollen that the iron collar was barely visible. As the wolfdog lunged at Hallie, Joe held his breath, bit down on the reins, took aim with both eyes open, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's retort caused Beans to rear back. As the horse went over, Joe let loose of the rifle as his twisted body struck a fence rail. He smelled gunpowder just before his head hit a post. Then everything went black. Joe woke with his aunt and Lucky staring down at him. He remembered shooting the rifle. Hallie helped him stand, and he looked down at the 666 brand on the lifeless wolfdog. After feeling his scalp, he eyed blood on his fingers. Joe grabbed his side, turned, and threw up. Hallie helped Joe to the house. She pointed at a Polaroid of Reuben taped to the side of the Frigidaire and dialed the phone for the Sandy Slough store. Joe talked to Jed and said he was looking for Reuben. He just drove up. "Hold on, I'll get him." Joe spoke to Reuben, telling him what had happened. Joe heard him yell, "The wolf dog is dead." Joe spoke of feeling sick and said he had pain in his left neck area. Reuben thought the injury might be a broken collarbone and said he'd be home soon. He worried about the blow to the boy's head. Joe kept gagging. Reuben returned home and called Jed, who said to get Joe to the hospital, adding the neck pain might be from internal bleeding. It's called Care's sign. He may have ruptured his spleen. Told him to bring Joe to the hangar where he kept his plane. Jed called the Valentine Hospital and told them he had a patient with possible internal bleeding. They advised him to bring the patient immediately. They knew Jed as the volunteer paramedic for the Flatwater fire and ambulance crew. They warned him their part-time surgeon was at the O'Neill Hospital to assist with a procedure. He'd check the boy's vitals and decide what to do. Jed arrived in the Flatwater ambulance and looked at Joe. They spoke briefly. He had seen this type of injury before, and again guessed the boy had ruptured his spleen. Jed confirmed there may be internal bleeding, but he appeared stable otherwise. Rechecked the boy's eyes with a flashlight and whispered concussion to Hallie and Reuben. The Valentine Hospital didn't have a doctor available to handle the surgery. They would either need to wait for a surgeon to drive to Valentine or send Jed to pick up the doctor. Or he could fly Joe directly to O'Neill. Reuben and Jed pushed the plane out of the building and helped Joe get on. Jed looked into Reuben and Hallie's worried eyes and shut the airplane's door. With shaking hands and a scared face, Hallie insisted they follow the boy. They called Joe's parents, who were closer to O'Neill, and would beat them to the hospital. Jed took off. He flashed back to his helicopter life flight after the hay baler took his arm. He had nothing to give the boy for his discomfort. Joe asked for water, but Jed said not to drink anything in case he needed surgery. The boy spoke of what Jed deduced to be double vision. When he landed the plane at the O'Neill airport, he was greeted by an ambulance. Brody wore a back and neck brace when he looked at the Omaha World Herald. The bottom of the front page had a picture of Joe Bauer in a hospital bed holding a $4,000 check from the State Wildlife Commission for his killing of the wolf dog. There was no picture of the animal or mention of the 666 mark on its side. The article also spoke of his emergency surgery. Brody's attorney called Reuben Bauer and told him Mr. Broadwell would not renew the pasture lease. Reuben informed the attorney, "I would not lease my land to that shitheel again anyway." 25 Sojourn reward. Joe's mother, Susan, was beside herself. She had nearly lost her only child. And now he talked about wanting to buy a car and returning to football by the end of the season, all as if nothing had even happened. "I found one I want to get. It's a Mercury Cougar. The guy said he'd sell the car for the Blue Book price. And now I have the money to buy it. It belongs to Jed, Jedediah Foster. It was his brother's car. Jed and Uncle Reuben are good friends." Joe readjusted himself in bed. His butt hurt, but that paled to the stiffness and soreness left by the splenectomy. The 6-inch scar on the low left side of his belly would be a lifelong tattoo. He guessed the guys in the locker room would call him Scarbelly. Felt the tender part of his scalp and took a drink of coffee the nurse brought him. Joe's mother, Susan, Kleenex in hand, stared at him. "Good Lord, Joseph. You're recovering from major surgery, and you have a concussion. And you should have had a haircut before you had your picture taken for the paper. You look like a wild man. And it would help if you started shaving, too. You've had a crazy summer, you know. Between beer parties, black eyes from fistfights, and flying in airplanes. Reuben told me you'd flown in that plane before. And shooting guns. and the fall from the horse. Good Lord, you could have been killed. You know what an accident did to your father. It changed his whole life. Our lives. What if you had missed the wolf? What might have happened to you lying there unconscious on the ground? And Lord only knows whatever else you're not telling me. My son and his secrets. So no, I'm not real excited about you getting a new car. His mother wiped at her eyes again. And when did you start drinking coffee? Joe took it all in. It's not new, Mom. It's used. But it's a good car. We just have to get her here from Flatwater. You could have died, Joseph. Do you hear me? Susan wiped her nose with the tissue. Joe was glad his mother knew nothing of almost drowning while Skinny dipping in the lake, of the bee sting accident on the hay sweep, leaving him with bruised ribs, and the wolfdog chasing him on foot, and getting married at the beer party. Best his mother not know any of it. More secrets. I'm okay, Mom. Talk it over with your father. I'm going to go find a coffee. Jim said nothing during Susan's outburst. He stood and moved stiffly. Joe asked again about getting the car. It's your money, Joseph, and I guess you're old enough to take care of a car. You scared your mother, and she's right. It could have been worse. She's just being a mom. Joe's dad moved flowers in a vase shaped like a football his Ewing classmates had sent. He noticed another set of flowers with a card sticking out, which read, "Get well soon, hubby. Nanette Bruilette." Joe said, I know. So, can I get the car? Reuben says he was happy with your summer work. He'll send you a check so there's a little more money. It's a good thing because cars cost money. You got fuel, oil, and repairs. Gas costs over $1 per gallon now. Mom and I could cover your insurance, I guess. He added, It's been said, with age comes responsibility. A nurse had moved Joe's cowboy hat, which Hallie and Reuben had brought during their visit. Jim turned the hat over, resting it on its crown, brim up. Yes, Joseph, you've had an interesting summer, but smooth seas do not a skillful sailor make. Joe's mother walked in holding a cup of coffee and carrying purple and red flowers in a vase shaped like an airplane. More flowers, Joseph. These are from Caroline. His mother stuck out her chin and gave her son a look. So who is this Caroline girl? 26. Fall migration. Joe and his dad drove to Flatwater to pick up the Mercury Cougar X, R7 from Jed Foster. Jed was glad to sell the car to the boy. His brother would have been happy with the new owner. Jed said he planned to donate the money from the sale of the vehicle to the American Legion, adding Joe needed to name the car. Told him, Joseph, you've had quite a splendiferous summer. Nanette Bruilette waited in the Sandy Slough General Store as Joe, and his dad dropped off a check and acquired the title and keys for the Cougar. Her presence was no coincidence. Jim watched his son talk to the dark-haired girl as the girl's mother hovered nearby. Nan handed Joe an extra-large manila envelope, and the two smiled and politely shook hands. The mother, Jeanette, raised her eyebrows at Jim as she and her daughter left the store. Joe found a note along with the keyring. Nan said she enjoyed their short marriage. Noted Joe should keep the ring, as he might need it again the next time he gets married. She included a charcoal drawing of a girl and a boy dancing on a bridge over running water with an owl and a three-quarter moon overhead. In the corner, Nan wrote, Angler's Bridge Boogie. Hallie and Reuben rode to the wolfdog's burial site on the hill overlooking Cove Lake. They had covered the grave site with stones from the North Loop River. Reuben had chiseled white wolfdog 1980 onto a flat stone. The state wildlife agents wanted the animal for examination, but Joe, Hallie, and Reuben wished the animal to be buried on the ranch, undisturbed. Reuben tacked the wolfdog's iron collar to the cottonwood log at the lake as a reminder of the evil in the world. Reuben took a seat on the log next to Cove Lake. Summer had faded to fall, and they'd need to move the cows closer to the home place and wean the calves. There was still prairie hay to haul into the stackyard, winter feed for the cattle, and more protection against the cold wind. He came to an agreement with the neighbor on their offer to rent part of his ranch and buy his black mother cows. Included in the deal was that the neighbor's son and new wife could live in the bunkhouse. Asked if the son and his wife could be hired to help calve out the Bauer ranch's remaining herd the following spring. They floated the idea of renting their entire ranch, save for their home. Hallie asked him to purchase crushed oyster shells for her garden's fall fertilizer. Hinted with her hands they should get laying hens. The calcium in crushed oyster shells also made eggs stronger. She also asked him to remember to buy bird food. Her face reflected that the birds would surely starve if she did not fill the bird feeder. A chattering of starlings twisted and turned as they shape-shifted like a flying spirit above the lake. Their murmurations and whooshing wings meshed with the rustling gold leaves on the standing cottonwoods. The fall funk of decaying grass and water weeds let everyone know a change was coming. The seasons sped by faster the older one became. Reuben thought about how the earth continued to rotate on its tilted axis, and all the cataclysms and evil in the world would never change that. Thank goodness Joe was around when it all came to a head. He closed his mind to what might have happened with the wolfdog and Hallie. He thought of the boy's letter, thanking him for a good summer and the pay. Inside the letter was a Polaroid picture Joe secretly took from behind Hallie, Reuben, and Lucky as they walked down the lane toward a setting sun. Franken beans grazed as Lucky sniffed near the old cottonwood log. He thought of his grandfather, who came to Nebraska from Austria with his new wife. Reuben had the grandfather's height on the father's Austrian side, but he obtained his dark, ruddy complexion from his mother, a stout gypsy maiden. The scarred seagull flew in, making its meowing and whoo-whoo clatter, its last visit to the lake this year. Joe had told the uncle he should give it a name. Reuben decided to start calling the bird Moses. Reuben pitched Mo pieces of bread Hallie had made. A cohort of white whooping cranes and their gray sandhill crane cousins took flight. The flock's seesawing squawks would lead them south on their fall migration. Reuben looked at his wife and thought of their chance meeting when on leave from the Navy. Her eyes, the color of green marbles, stopped him still. He bought her an ice cream cone on a beach. The tall girl with fresh freckles like dew drops on pink parchment, long rosy curls, covered hands, and no voice, left him speechless. Hallie wore no shoes. Loose from the chignon, her scarlet tresses blew around her face and shoulders. White streaks had started to show on her red curls. She noticed that her eyes, once green and then olive, had turned to a crinkled amber, the color of dying leaves. Hallie hiked up her dress and tucked it into the sash. Her white gloves were left on the kitchen table. She walked into the lake and pulled the tin whistle from its cloth holder to play a composition for Reuben, music first heard long ago. Blowing their staccato trumpets, a bevy of white swans swam in her direction. The young cygnets with brown and gray feathers trailed behind. She rarely saw these elegant birds in large groups, undoubtedly a sign of good luck. After the melody, Hallie put the whistle away and shouldered the pouch. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a letter she'd received from Joe. He thanked her for all her kindness and all the delicious meals she'd cooked, and he included the Polaroid picture of a jawbone. Joe wrote, "I returned the jawbone to Cove Lake. I thought you'd like to know. And thank you for saving my life." Hallie often wondered why she chose not to reveal herself that day at the lake when the boy almost drowned. Her irrational modesty forced her to hide in the weedy shallows with hands bloodied after jerking barbed wire from the boy's leg. Hiding was always her immediate impulse. She learned long ago you cannot change the past. Hallie bent and cupped the lake with fused fingers formed by a hereditary birth defect. She felt the coolness of the water while taking in its rich smell and vibrant blue, green and brown colors. Hallie would always miss the ocean, having spent hours hiding in its surf. Water was her only escape during her lonesome youth. Hallie loved their ranch in the Sandhills, but knew her husband's riding and roping days were about over. She had hoped they would never have to leave the prairie that lay like a soft quilt over their world. Her maritime mind adored the prairie's description, an ocean of grass. As the day's dusk draped over them, Hallie smiled and let the lake water spill away. The fading sunlight shone on her damaged hands. Hands that were further scarred while escaping a house fire with only the nightdress she wore and the Bible she frantically grabbed off the kitchen table with her tiny burnt fingers. Silent screams to warn her parents went unheard. Hallie left the house and looked for her family, who were not so lucky. Of course, there were also the scars from abuse by an extended family, forced to care for an orphaned mute child with red hair and an ugly deformity. They'd prattle on how the evil comet the girl was born under had been a curse. Reuben saved her. The light of his love overwhelmed the darkness. 27. Winter solstice. Due to his spleen injury and concussion, Joe had a slow start to his junior year of high school. His doctor said it was fortunate Joe was physically fit, as that would aid in his recovery. He watched every football practice from the sidelines. As his incision healed, he began to practice kicking the football. His coach let him play in the year's final game, and he made 2-point-after-touchdown kicks. Joe received his letter in football. At the end of the school semester, he received a D- in algebra. Joe considered joining the military to pursue his aviation interests after graduation. His guidance counselor warned him his dyslexia might hamper such an endeavor. His mother, who knew about dyslexia, guided her son in a different direction. In the school library, he researched the Nebraska state regulations on becoming a licensed private investigator. He did not tell his mother. On the winter solstice before Christmas, Joe, his mother, and his father drove to Reuben and Hallie's ranch. Upon their arrival, Joe noticed that the washhouse pile had been burned. White snow bordered the blackened sand as smoke drifted skyward. Hallie greeted Joe with a hug. A star sat atop a red cedar Christmas tree near the quilting frame. A just-started quilt bore a hand-painted meadowlark block. His mother brought jelly and pickles she had canned. Joe handed Hallie a gift he'd bought and wrapped himself. It was the novel about a husband and wife who live by a lighthouse near the ocean. He then gave Reuben a Kansas City Royals baseball cap. Reuben curved the brim and placed it on his head. It was a bust they lost the World Series. "I am glad you didn't give me a clock. Just learned getting a clock as a Christmas present is bad luck," commented on the boy's attempt to grow a mustache. Reuben put a Bing Crosby Christmas album on the close-and-play stereo. Hallie had prepared pan-seared beef steaks, green beans, baked potatoes, orange fluff salad, and beer-braised carrots with cheese, getting the fluff and carrot recipes from the daily recipe on the AM radio. They also had Christmas rum cake made in a bundt pan, served with store-bought vanilla ice cream and coffee. Reuben said their oven element quit working that morning, but he had a replacement ready in case such a thing might happen. "You need to anticipate in the Sandhills." Susan told Hallie and Reuben that a man stalked and killed John Lennon. Jim relayed, "The killer said he knew the act was evil." Susan said they learned who shot J.R. Ewing on the Dallas television show. The couple, with no TV set, nodded and smiled. Reuben said Father Kowalski won the American Legion Christmas raffle for Hallie's flower quilt. Rumor was the priest spent $100 on raffle tickets. Reuben asked if they'd seen the sundog in the sky that morning. With no white gloves, Hallie played Silent Night on her Irish tin whistle for all to hear. After the meal, Joe rode beans to Cove Lake under a transparent sheet of cirrostratus clouds. The snow-covered prairie reminded the boy of white frosting on a tiered wedding cake. As Lucky followed along, he angled the brim of the Uncle's Stetson beaver to block the winter breeze. White fog blew from all three while the horse's hooves crunched on frozen bluestem. The sun strained to reveal its warm light. He stopped at the wolfdog's gravesite on the hill overlooking the lake. He wiped dust and snow off the flat stone grave marker and traced the letters with a finger. Joe remembered John Thunderhawk saying, "The spirit of those you have killed may choose to follow you." The wolfdog had followed him. Sometimes, at night, he dreamed he was on the hill above Cove Lake, yowling a high-pitched yowl. Joe sat on the cottonwood log and looked over the ice-covered water. The frosted surface deflected and bent sunbeams, casting crinkled brown, green, and blue light waves like pied paths to the future. He saw Reuben had tacked a horseshoe to the log with the open end at the top. Considered walking out on the ice. With their alligator bark and bare branches, the stalwart cottonwoods creaked in the crisp breeze. Lucky leaped and caught a snack Joe snuck from the aunt's cookie jar. The dog then curled at his feet out of the winter wind. He rubbed sand off the wolfdog's iron collar pegged between the tin star and the horseshoe. Joe tugged the Stetson and lifted the coat's collar. As he played a tune on his harmonica, a cardinal flew in, chanting its choppy chirps and breathless whistles from a dead sunflower stalk. The blood-red bird, a holy messenger and a harbinger of the good and evil to come. The end.